The twilight years of the Liang dynasty felt less like the fading of an old order and more like the frantic cracking of an overstretched shell. The capital at Jiankang, nestled on the southern banks of the Yangtze, still sparkled with memories of grandeur, but beneath the tiled roofs and temple bells lay the bitter truth. The dynasty had lost its grip. Warlords carved out provinces as if they were cutting a melon, and court officials whispered not of reforms but of survival. It was in this vacuum of legitimacy, this air thick with both desperation and opportunity, that a man named Chen Dynasty began to rise. Now, Chen Dynasty wasn't born into the gilded halls of the Liang court. He came from more modest roots in Wuxing, modern-day Zhejiang, a place known more for its rolling hills and hard-working farmers than for power brokers. His family was of the gentry class, but not particularly exalted. That, in many ways, became his advantage. Unlike those trapped by the ritualized arrogance of aristocratic birth, Chen carried the scrappiness of someone who had clawed his way forward. His education gave him polish, but his early military service carved the steel into his bones. He learned not just how to fight, but how to read men, their weaknesses, their hungers, their fears. That talent, more than any sword, became his weapon of choice. The Liang court itself practically handed him the opportunity. By the mid-6th century, the dynasty's emperor, Liang Wu, Shaoyan, was already in decline, both in body and in influence. His once stable realm had been cracked by rebellions, most notably the devastating He Jing Rebellion, 548 to 552, which had left the empire scorched and humiliated. He Jing, a former general who had turned into a marauding warlord, stormed Jiankang, seized the emperor, and threw the dynasty into chaos. Even after He Jing was killed, the rebellion's scars remained raw: burned cities, famine-stricken villages, and endless suspicion within the ruling elite. In times like these, men of action rather than lineage could vault themselves upward. Chen Dynasty was exactly that sort of man. He started as a mid-tier commander during the campaigns against He Jing, and though at first few noticed him, he steadily distinguished himself. Unlike many aristocratic commanders who preferred to strategize from a cushioned tent, Chen rode with his troops, ate their rough rations, and carried himself with a kind of unpretentious charisma. Soldiers respected him because he respected them, or at least convinced them he did. That gave him loyalty at a time when loyalty was as rare as silver coins. But here's the thing, Chen Dynasty wasn't simply a brave battlefield leader. He had the uncanny ability to sense when a political wind was about to shift. After He Jing's downfall, many commanders scrambled to secure territory or curry favor with exhausted Liang princes. Chen, instead, positioned himself carefully, never overreaching, never making himself too threatening, but quietly building alliances. He was the kind of man who could smile in court, flatter a superior, and then quietly make arrangements that ensured he'd be indispensable the next day. Was it ambition? Of course. But it was ambition tempered by patience, which is rarer than people think. The fall of He Jing left the Liang rulers scrambling to restore order, yet they never truly did. One emperor after another seemed more like a placeholder than a monarch. By the 550s, the dynasty was wobbling on stilts and provinces acted almost as independent states. Northern powers, Northern Qi and Northern Zhou, loomed hungrily beyond the Yangtze, watching like hawks circling prey. Chen Dynasty, by then holding command in key provinces of the lower Yangtze, had effectively carved out his own sphere of influence. What separated him from other warlords was not just his martial capability, but the perception that he could provide stability. People in chaotic times cling to whoever seems able to protect them, even if protection comes at the cost of submission. There's a curious irony here. The very chaos that destroyed Liang also became the forge for Chen's legitimacy. Every burned field and abandoned village, every shift in allegiance by opportunistic nobles only underscored the need for someone who could step in and say, "Follow me, and you'll survive." And so, step by step, Chen moved from loyal general to kingmaker. His big break came in 555, when he supported Xiao Fangji, a Liang prince, against rivals who sought to exploit the vacuum. Chen's military backing gave Xiao Fangji the throne, albeit briefly. This was a turning point. On the one hand, Chen was playing the role of loyal servant, placing a prince on the throne and maintaining the facade of Liang legitimacy. On the other hand, everyone could see who held the real reins. When an emperor sits uneasily while a general commands confidently, it doesn't take a genius to see which way history is about to tilt. By 557, the pretense had run its course. Xiao Fangji, the puppet, was dethroned. Qin Baxian, now in his 50s, declared himself emperor and founded the Chen Dynasty, taking the regnal title Emperor Wu of Qin. For the first time in Chinese history, a man from relatively modest beginnings in the south had seized the mandate of heaven not by inheritance, but by sheer survival, military acumen, and political calculation. It was both shocking and, in hindsight, inevitable. And yet, let's pause for a moment. This wasn't a triumphal march into everlasting glory. The Qin dynasty began not from abundance, but from exhaustion. Its foundation lay on ground scarred by rebellion, its coffers drained, its people weary. Qin Baxian was less a conqueror sweeping in with overwhelming force than a survivor patching together a broken house. Still, survival in such an era was no small feat to carve out legitimacy when rivals prowled on all sides, when famine and floods threatened stability, and when elites doubted his pedigree. That was an accomplishment in itself. If you picture it cinematically, imagine the old Liang palace halls dimly lit, banners of a dying dynasty drooping in the humid southern air. Then imagine Qin Baxian, pragmatic and unpretentious, stepping into those halls not as a guest, but as the new master. Behind him, weary soldiers who had seen too many wars. Before him, ministers uncertain whether to bow in loyalty or tremble in fear. That was the moment the Qin dynasty was born, not with grand celebration, but with the weary sigh of a nation clinging to yet another hope for stability. When Qin Baxian finally stepped across the line from kingmaker to emperor, it wasn't with the thunderous applause of a united people, but with the heavy silence of necessity. The Liang dynasty had been bleeding legitimacy for years, and Xiao Fangji, the last puppet Prince Qin had propped up, was little more than a figurehead waiting for the next gust of political wind to blow him aside. In late 557, that gust came not from an external enemy, but from Chen himself. With the court already dancing to his tune, he orchestrated a quiet yet decisive shift. The Liang emperor was deposed, and Chen proclaimed himself the son of heaven, founding what would be known as the Qin dynasty. Now, it's easy to picture this as a bold coronation, the kind we see in dramas, silken robes, chanting officials, incense smoke rising like threads of destiny. But if you strip away the ceremony, what really happened was more practical. Qin didn't storm the palace, he already controlled it. He didn't have to chase rivals out of Jiankang, they'd either fled, bowed, or been sidelined. The throne was less seized than simply occupied, like an empty chair in a chaotic room finally claimed by the one person with the nerve to sit down. And let's be honest, Qin Baxian wasn't a young, untested upstart. By the time he took the throne, he was in his 50s, seasoned by decades of war, betrayal, and political maneuvering. That's not young by 6th century standards, especially for someone who had spent much of his life in the mud of campaigns. His age gave him gravitas, but it also carried the weight of urgency. This wasn't the beginning of a long reign. It was the desperate middle act of a man trying to hold together a fractured world. The way he framed his claim to legitimacy was clever. He didn't say outright, "I took the throne because I wanted it." Instead, he invoked the tried-and-true language of the mandate of heaven. The Liang dynasty, racked by rebellion and humiliation, had clearly lost heaven's favor. The empire needed stability, and heaven had signaled its will by allowing Chen's victories over Ho Jing and his steady hand during the Liang collapse. This wasn't ambition, he implied, it was duty. And in a society where cosmic order mattered just as much as earthly power, that justification was more than just words. It was the thin veneer that made his coup palatable to both elites and commoners alike. Still, not everyone was convinced. Many aristocrats in Jiankang and beyond sneered at Chen's pedigree. He wasn't born into one of the great southern lineages that had dominated politics for centuries. He was a soldier, a provincial man, someone whose roots didn't wind deep into the aristocratic clans that traced their bloodlines back to Han or even earlier. For some, bowing to Chen was like bowing to fortune itself, necessary but distasteful. Yet their sneers mattered little when his soldiers still stood guard outside the palace gates. Power speaks louder than lineage, at least when blades are sharp and coffers are just full enough to pay the troops. Chen himself seemed aware of this tension. He didn't drape himself in excessive pomp, nor did he attempt to outshine the aristocrats in literary sophistication. Instead, he presented himself as a practical ruler, a restorer of order. His reign name, Emperor Wu, carried echoes of martial strength, a reminder that his authority came not from inherited nobility, but from the sword and the loyalty of his men. In that sense, he resembled the founders of other dynasties who had clawed their way upward from obscurity, from Han Gaozu centuries earlier to the many military strongmen who would follow. The coronation also symbolized something larger, the persistence of southern rule. Since the fall of the Han, northern dynasties had risen and fallen in the Central Plains, while the south clung to autonomy across the Yangtze. The Chen Dynasty, though born of necessity, represented the last gasp of that southern independence. Few in 557 could have guessed that within 3 decades, the sway would sweep away this fragile house, but in that moment, Chen Baxian's enthronement was a statement. The South still stood. Of course, standing is not the same as thriving. The new emperor inherited a realm in shambles. The treasury was thin, the granaries emptier still, and the countryside scarred by Ho Jing's devastation. Famine had pushed many into banditry, and provincial governors often acted with near-total independence. Northern Qi and Northern Zhou were stronger, richer, and more unified than Chen's fragile court. The Chen Dynasty began not with abundance, but with austerity, and Chen Baxian knew it. He set about shoring up what little he could, repairing fortifications, reorganizing military garrisons, and trying, however imperfectly, to restore civil administration. If we zoom in on the capital, Jiankang itself tells the story. Once a glittering hub of the southern dynasties, filled with poets, calligraphers, and Buddhist temples, it now bore the scars of Ho Jing's sack. Markets struggled to revive, artisans searched for patrons, and the court felt smaller, more fragile. The great clans remained, but their confidence had been shaken. Into this space stepped Chen Baxian, not promising a golden age, but offering survival. And sometimes, survival is enough to make people bow. There's also a personal dimension to this moment that's easy to overlook. Imagine Chen himself, a man who had spent most of his life in armor, suddenly finding himself robed in imperial silk. He'd ridden with soldiers, eaten rough millet on campaign, barked orders over the din of battle, and now he was expected to sit in a palace, issue decrees, and embody the Son of Heaven. Did he feel the weight of contradiction? Did he ever glance at the carved dragons of the throne and think, I was never supposed to be here? Perhaps. But if he did, he never let it show. His reign began with steady pragmatism, as though he knew he didn't have the luxury of hesitation. What Chen Baxian achieved in 557 was both modest and monumental. Modest, because the dynasty he founded was small, fragile, and perpetually at risk of being swallowed by its stronger northern neighbors. Monumental, because in a time when legitimacy was crumbling, he created something new out of the ashes. The Chen Dynasty didn't begin with overwhelming force or dazzling prosperity. It began with a man who refused to let chaos dictate the future. And maybe that's the most human part of the story. Dynasties are often remembered for their glittering heights or their dramatic falls, but their beginnings are usually quieter, born from men and women simply refusing to give up. Chen Baxian's ascent to the throne wasn't the triumph of destiny, it was the determination of a survivor who saw a broken empire and decided he would rather hold it together himself than watch it crumble further. The moment Chen Baxian took the throne, the crown weighed heavier than any helmet he had ever worn. Battles on the field had tested his courage, but the battlefield at least offered clarity. You could see your enemy, measure your odds, and strike or retreat. Governing an exhausted empire was far murkier. Problems didn't march in neat ranks, they seeped into every corner of life, empty granaries, restless soldiers, rebellious provinces, and skeptical aristocrats. In many ways, Chen's greatest war began the day he put on the dragon robe. First came the simple, brutal reality of resources. The Ho Jing rebellion had gutted Liang's wealth, and Chen inherited little more than scraps. Jiankang's treasuries held only a fraction of what they once had, and tax revenues trickled in weekly from provinces still recovering from scorched earth campaigns. Soldiers who had followed Chen through loyalty and charisma now needed food and coin. Grain shipments along the Yangtze were unreliable. Local uprisings disrupted supply lines. Chen's ministers scrambled for solutions, raising taxes on already burdened peasants, pressing artisans into service, forcing wealthy clans to donate stores of rice and silk. None of it felt sustainable, but survival rarely allows for elegance. Then there was the geography of power itself. Chen's dynasty stretched across the lower Yangtze and into parts of what's now Jiangsu, Zhejiang, and Fujian rich lands, yes, but fragmented. The great river that gave the south its lifeline also divided it. Control over water routes meant everything, and local governors, sitting in their fortified provincial seats, often acted like mini-kings. Chen knew he couldn't govern from Jiankang alone. He relied on a network of generals and administrators he trusted, many of them former comrades from his campaigns. But trust was a dangerous currency. Show too much and you looked weak, show too little and men began to suspect you of paranoia. Aristocrats posed another problem. For centuries, the great southern clans, the Xia, the Wang, the Shen, had dominated politics. Their sons filled the bureaucracy, their daughters linked houses through marriage, their estates sprawled across fertile farmland. These families had tolerated Chen's rise because they had no choice, but tolerance isn't loyalty. Many whispered behind closed doors that this soldier emperor lacked refinement, that he was an intruder in a game designed for pedigreed players. Chen's challenge was to bring them into the fold without becoming their puppet. His strategy was careful. He distributed court offices among them, honored their traditions, but kept the real reins of military power firmly in his own hands. Externally, the picture was no less grim. To the north, Northern Qi and Northern Zhou eyed the south with practiced hunger. Both states were wealthier, better organized, and more militarized than Chen's fledgling dynasty. Any sign of weakness could invite invasion. Chen played his cards cautiously, sending envoys north, recognizing shifting borders when he had to, and emphasizing defense over reckless expansion. He couldn't afford grand campaigns. His armies were stretched just to hold the Yangtze line. So he leaned into strategy rather than force, fortifying river defenses and ensuring his navy, one of the South's unique strengths, was ready to counter northern incursions. What's striking about Chen Baxian during these first years is his pragmatism. He didn't chase utopias or promise golden ages. He focused on patching holes one by one, like a carpenter keeping a leaky ship afloat. He introduced modest tax reforms, tried to stabilize currency circulation, and pushed for rebuilding projects in Jiankang to restore a sense of normalcy. Did it work perfectly? Of course not. But even small measures mattered to a population exhausted by decades of upheaval. Sometimes just seeing roads repaired or markets reopened was enough to convince people that maybe, just maybe, stability was possible. Still, stability was fragile. Banditry flared in rural areas where officials couldn't project power. Floods along the Yangtze destroyed harvests. Epidemics swept through refugee camps of displaced families. Every crisis felt like a test of Chen's right to rule, a reminder that heaven's mandate wasn't a blank check, but a probationary contract. If he failed to provide order, heaven and the people could withdraw their support as quickly as they had given it. Inside the palace, Chen also had to wrestle with a subtler challenge, the performance of kingship itself. He'd spent his life in armor, speaking the blunt language of command. Now he was expected to embody the rituals of the Son of Heaven, presiding over court ceremonies, issuing edicts laced with Confucian moralism, consulting scholars on matters of state. It wasn't that he was ignorant. Chen had been educated enough to pass among the literate elite. But refinement wasn't his instinct. He compensated with discipline. Where his predecessors had sometimes indulged in extravagance, Chen kept his court restrained, projecting the image of a ruler focused on survival, not spectacle. And yet, one can't help but wonder what thoughts ran through his head at night in the palace. Did he feel like an imposter among the scrolls and jade ornaments, remembering instead the mud of campaigns and the taste of soldiers' rations? Or did he sense, perhaps with grim satisfaction, that he was more qualified to rule than the pampered princes who had squandered Liang's legacy? Either way, he played the role with just enough skill to maintain control. The early challenges of Chen's reign, then, weren't about dazzling victories or sweeping reforms. They were about holding the line against famine, against rebellion, against northern opportunism, against the arrogance of aristocrats. Chen didn't build a dynasty of abundance, he built a dynasty of resilience. And while historians often look back at Chen's house as small and short-lived, it's worth remembering how fragile survival itself was in the 6th century. That Chen managed to steady the ship at all was its own kind of achievement. If you picture it in human terms, think of a weary craftsman patching a cracked vase with whatever tools he can find. It won't hold forever, but for now, it stands. That was Chen Baxian's early reign, fragile, imperfect, but standing. If Chen Baxian's early reign was about patching cracks at home, his eyes never strayed too far from the horizon, because on that horizon loomed two formidable northern powers, Northern Qi and Northern Zhou. Both sat like wolves across the river, biding their time, their soldiers drilled, their economies stronger, their aristocracies more entrenched. The Chen Dynasty, small and weary, was the weakest of the so-called Southern dynasties. Everyone knew it. The question was whether Chen could keep the predators at bay long enough to stabilize his fragile house. Northern Qi controlled the northeast, with its capital at Yi. Though plagued by its own corruption and decadence, it still commanded a powerful military machine and the resources of the Yellow River Basin. Northern Zhou, to the west, was in some ways harsher, more disciplined, with Xianbei steppe traditions woven into its ruling class, and an appetite for expansion that had already brought it into bloody clashes with Qi. The two were locked in their own rivalry, and that rivalry gave Chen a slender chance. As long as Qi and Zhou were busy hacking at each other, the south could breathe. But the danger was always that once one wolf brought the other to heel, it would turn its gaze southward. Chen Baxian understood this balance intimately. He wasn't naive enough to believe he could outmatch them militarily. His realm lacked the manpower, the cavalry, the sheer industrial base. So he played a subtler game, the game of positioning. Envoys went north, bearing gifts and polite words, weaving diplomacy like a fisherman casting nets. He offered recognition of borders when necessary, nodded to the legitimacy of northern rulers in exchange for breathing space, and tried to avoid provocations. Was it humiliating? Perhaps, but humiliation was cheaper than annihilation. Still, border skirmishes were inevitable. Along the Wai River, the rough dividing line between north and south, troops clashed in endless small engagements. Sometimes it was formal, regiments testing each other's strength, burning outposts, capturing villages. Other times it was little more than banditry under military banners. Villagers living along those frontiers bore the brunt, their homes raided by whichever side passed through, their loyalty questioned no matter whom they offered grain to. For them, the rivalry of states wasn't abstract politics, it was hunger, fear, and displacement. Chen's advantage lay in the geography of the Yangtze. That river was more than a border, it was a moat. Northern cavalry, so effective on the open plains, struggled against the watery defenses of the south. Chen's navy, modest but well-positioned, could intercept crossings, turning what might have been sweeping invasions into grinding stalemates. Chen poured resources into strengthening river fortifications, ensuring that even if northern armies massed on the other side, their advance would slow to a crawl. In this sense, the Yangtze was the dynasty's greatest general. But there's an irony in this defensive posture. While Chen was securing the south against the north, he was also boxing his own dynasty in. The Chen could never project power far beyond their river defenses. They were condemned to reactive strategy. Unlike Qi and Zhou, who dreamed of uniting China under their banners, Chen's dynasty could only realistically aim to survive. And survival, though practical, lacks the glamour of conquest. Later historians, writing under the Sui and Tang, would look back and see the Qin as minor players, their story overshadowed by the sweeping northern dynasties. Yet in their own time, holding the line against Qi and Zhou was anything but minor. There were also moments of opportunism. Whenever Qi and Zhou tore at each other's throats, Qin considered pushing north to reclaim lost ground. A handful of expeditions were launched, probing into Huai River territory, testing the waters. Sometimes these campaigns scored quick victories, capturing towns or fortresses. But sustaining those gains was another matter. Chen's soldiers, drawn mostly from the south, weren't suited for long campaigns deep in enemy territory. Supplies stretched thin, northern counterattacks swift and brutal. Again and again, the lesson was clear: the south could sting, but it couldn't strike a killing blow. What's fascinating here is the way Chen Dynasty, and later his successors, understood the psychology of rivalry. They didn't try to outshine the north, they tried to outlast it. They knew that northern Qi was rotting from within, its court riddled with decadence and corruption, while northern Zhou's harsh discipline created resentments of its own. If Qin could endure, perhaps heaven's mandate would shift, and the south might inherit the chance to reunify China. It was a long shot, but in the 6th century, long shots were often the only shots available. And yet, time was never truly on Chen's side. Every year that passed, the south bled resources just holding its borders. Every soldier stationed along the river meant fewer in the countryside to suppress bandits or guard against rebellion. Every tax grain diverted to fortresses was grain not feeding peasants. The rivalry with Qi and Zhou wasn't just a matter of battles fought and lost, it was a slow drain, like water seeping through cracked walls. Still, Chen Dynasty faced these challenges with the same steady pragmatism that had brought him to power. He didn't gamble recklessly, nor did he cower. He held the line, relied on the river, and waited for his rivals to exhaust themselves. It wasn't a strategy that promised glory, but it promised survival. And for the Chen Dynasty, survival was enough. If you imagine it from a bird's-eye view, picture the map of China in the late 550s, Qi in the northeast, Zhou in the northwest, both gnashing at each other like rival wolves, and below the Great Bend of the Yangtze, the small but stubborn Qin, clutching its river-fortified lands, watching, waiting, refusing to yield. That tension, fragile, precarious, and strangely enduring, defined the dynasty's place in the chessboard of its age. Once Chen Dynasty secured the throne and shored up his borders as best he could, the next pressing challenge was inside the walls of his own house: how to actually govern. Armies might win or lose battles, but without a system to feed, tax, and regulate people, no dynasty lasts long. And here's the thing: Chen wasn't walking into a blank canvas. He inherited the battered shell of Liang's bureaucracy, its offices filled with men from aristocratic families who looked at him with half-hearted loyalty at best. Reform wasn't a matter of rewriting everything from scratch, it was more like trying to stitch torn cloth together while people tugged at it from all sides. His first priority was revenue, because without coin and grain, nothing else mattered. The Liang dynasty had already experimented with versions of the equal field system, a land allocation practice designed to prevent the wealthy from swallowing up farmland and starving the state of tax income. In theory, land was parceled out by the government based on household size, with plots returned to the state when the farmer died. In practice, of course, powerful clans found loopholes. They seized land, coerced peasants into dependency, and hoarded resources that never made it into tax registers. Chen's officials tried to enforce these rules more strictly, redistributing abandoned or confiscated land to commoners and pressuring landlords to report holdings honestly. Did it solve everything? Not even close. But it sent a message: this emperor wasn't just going to let the clans run the show. Taxation reforms came next, though calling them reforms might make them sound more polished than they were. Qin needed grain for soldiers and silk for salaries. His government streamlined assessments, cracked down on corrupt local magistrates who skimmed from collections, and tried to regularize household registrations so families couldn't dodge census obligations. These weren't glamorous moves, no poet sang praises about a cleaner tax register, but they mattered. A stable flow of revenue, even if modest, was the lifeblood of Chen's survival. Then there was the issue of law and order. The chaos of Ho Jing's rebellion had left provinces teeming with bandits, many of them former soldiers turned desperate marauders. Local officials often cut deals with these groups, turning blind eyes in exchange for bribes or protection. Chen couldn't allow that kind of patchwork anarchy to fester. His regime sent out military expeditions specifically aimed at clearing roads and suppressing bandit leaders. Harsh punishments followed: executions, confiscations, public displays of authority meant to remind people that a central state still existed. Again, it wasn't perfect. Banditry never disappeared. But enough order was restored to make commerce possible again, and that alone was a victory. One of Chen's more subtle reforms involved how he staffed his government. The aristocracy still dominated the upper rungs, and Chen couldn't simply dislodge them. He needed their cooperation, their networks, and their veneer of legitimacy. But he also inserted his own loyalists, men of lesser birth who had risen through military service, into important posts. These new men owed their fortunes to Chen, not to their clans. The balance was delicate: lean too heavily on the aristocrats and he risked becoming their puppet, lean too much on outsiders and he risked alienating the old guard. By weaving the two together, Chen bought himself breathing room. Another important area was infrastructure. War had wrecked dikes, canals, and roads, especially around the lower Yangtze where flooding was always a danger. Chen's government directed resources into repairing irrigation systems, clearing silted canals, and making sure that surplus grain could move more easily between provinces. Farmers noticed the difference. Better irrigation meant better harvests, which meant fuller bellies. In a time of constant instability, even small improvements in daily life carried outsized political weight. Religion also played a role in governance. Buddhism was flourishing in the south during this period, and temples often doubled as centers of local authority. Chen recognized their influence and supported monastic communities, granting lands or tax exemptions in exchange for public prayers, charity, and symbolic endorsement of his rule. Some might call this co-opting, but in truth it was mutual dependence. Temples gained protection and resources, while the dynasty gained legitimacy through sacred association. Taoism, too, maintained its foothold, and Chen carefully balanced the two, ensuring neither felt neglected. Now, was Chen Baxian a revolutionary reformer? Not really. His reign was too short, his resources too strained. Most of his policies were pragmatic stopgaps rather than visionary overhauls. He didn't have the luxury of long-term experiments. He was patching a leaky ship while waves pounded the hull. But even so, his efforts at governance reveal a man who understood that power isn't just about swords. You can win battles, but if the people don't see roads repaired, bandits checked, and taxes kept within reason, loyalty evaporates. If you look at the Chen Dynasty's internal governance in this early period, it's best described as functional minimalism. They weren't building grand new systems or commissioning sweeping codes of law. They were doing just enough to hold the state together, enough to keep the soldiers fed, the aristocrats placated, the farmers tilling, and the monks praying. In the long arc of Chinese history, this may not look like much. But for the men and women living in the 560s, it was the thin line between order and chaos. And perhaps that's the lesson: dynasties don't always rise on brilliant reforms or dazzling visions. Sometimes they rise because one man decides that survival itself is worth organizing around, and because enough people decide that survival, even under a new banner, is better than the alternative. When people think of dynasties, they often picture armies clashing or emperors scheming in palaces. But culture, the poetry, the painting, the philosophy, the religion, is what gives a dynasty its soul. The Chen Dynasty, though short-lived and often dismissed as a minor power squeezed between giants, still carried the torch of southern China's cultural brilliance. And sometimes, in the quiet moments of its brief existence, the Qin court and its people produced things more enduring than their politics. Southern China in the 6th century was a fertile ground for culture, quite literally and figuratively. The lower Yangtze's lush landscapes, its rivers and mountains, inspired poets and painters alike. Jiankang, though scarred by Ho Jing's rebellion, remained a cosmopolitan hub where aristocrats, monks, merchants, and artisans mingled. The court may have been poorer than that of the great northern dynasties, but southern elites still prized refinement. For them, calligraphy and verse were as essential to status as titles or land. Even Qin emperors, military men by background, understood that to be taken seriously as rulers they had to patronize the arts. Buddhism, in particular, colored daily life. By the Qin period, the South had become one of the most vibrant centers of Buddhist activity in the world. Monks translated sutras, built temples, and debated doctrine in Jiankang's monasteries. The Qin emperors supported them, partly out of faith, partly out of politics. Buddhism lent legitimacy by framing rulers as dharma kings who protected the faithful. Temples, meanwhile, provided social services the fragile state couldn't always manage, feeding the poor, sheltering refugees, educating the young. In return, monks copied texts, chanted prayers, and spread the message that the dynasty had heaven's blessing. Taoism also remained influential, particularly in court circles where the pursuit of immortality and harmony with cosmic forces never went out of style. Taoist priests conducted rituals to ward off floods and epidemics, and their teachings infused poetry with themes of nature and transcendence. In many ways, Qin society thrived on this religious duality. Buddhism offered salvation from suffering, while Taoism offered alignment with the rhythms of nature. Together they gave people frameworks to endure the hardships of unstable times. Art and literature under the Qin reflected this mix of elegance and fragility. Poetry, always a favored medium in southern courts, often took on tones of longing, exile, and transience. Aristocrats who had survived the fall of Liang wrote verses tinged with nostalgia, remembering more prosperous days. New poets emerged too, capturing the landscapes of the South with delicate brushstrokes of words. The Yangtze, its misty mornings and shimmering reflections, appears again and again in Qin poetry, as symbol, as comfort, as boundary. Calligraphy, the art that married aesthetic beauty with moral character, remained a hallmark of elite identity. A man's brushstrokes said as much about him as his rank or deeds. Painting also flourished, though fewer works survive. Court painters and artisans depicted Buddhist themes, nature scenes, and portraits of nobles. Even everyday objects, ceramics, lacquerware, silk embroidery, carried traces of artistry. In times of turmoil, people often cling to beauty, and Qin artisans poured their skill into creating items that made daily life feel just a little more ordered, a little more dignified. One shouldn't forget music and performance either. The Qin court inherited the traditions of earlier southern dynasties, where refined music ensembles performed at banquets and rituals. Instruments like the qin, zither, and pipa lute filled palace halls with melodies that blended solemn ritual with personal expression. For commoners, local festivals and folk performances carried cultural life forward in their own way: puppet shows, storytellers, seasonal dances. Culture wasn't just a courtly pastime, it was woven into the rhythms of villages and marketplaces. What's striking is how resilient this cultural life proved. The Chen Dynasty didn't have the wealth or grandeur of the Han or Tang, yet it preserved the southern tradition of refinement that had blossomed since the Eastern Jin. Even as armies marched and borders shifted, scholars kept writing, monks kept translating, and painters kept painting. It's a reminder that culture often survives better than politics. Dynasties rise and fall, but poems outlast them. And maybe this is where the Qin left their quietest, but most meaningful legacy. While their political power barely lasted 3 decades, they served as custodians of southern China's cultural flame. When the Sui eventually swallowed the Qin in 589, they inherited not just a territory, but a tradition of Buddhist devotion, Taoist philosophy, poetic sensitivity, and artistic refinement that would flow into the great cultural flourishing of the Tang. If you imagine Jiankang at twilight during the Qin years, picture the sound of a monk's bell echoing from a riverside temple, a poet scribbling lines about the moon over the Yangtze, a musician plucking the strings of a qin in a half-rebuilt palace. Around them, soldiers might be patrolling walls, officials wrangling over taxes, peasants hauling grain. But in those moments, culture softened the edges of hardship. That's what made life in the Qin dynasty bearable and perhaps even beautiful. If culture gave the Qin dynasty its soul, the military gave it its backbone. Without soldiers to guard the Yangtze, enforce tax collection, and keep rival warlords in check, the dynasty would have collapsed within months of Qin Baxian taking the throne. The army was both the dynasty's greatest strength and its most dangerous liability, strong enough to defend, but also powerful enough that ambitious generals could fracture the fragile state if loyalty faltered. The Qin army wasn't vast by Chinese standards. It couldn't match the massive cavalry forces of northern Qi or northern Zhou, which drew from the endless plains of the north. Instead, it was built around what the South did best: infantry hardened by local warfare, militias raised from farming communities, and above all, a riverine navy that turned the Yangtze into a defensive wall. Ships mattered more than horses here. Qin commanders invested in sturdy war junks capable of patrolling waterways, transporting troops quickly, and cutting off northern invasions before they gained traction. In many ways, the river itself was the dynasty's most loyal general. The structure of the military reflected Qin Baxian's own background. He had risen through the ranks by commanding loyalty rather than relying on aristocratic pedigree, and he expected the same from his officers. Many of his closest commanders were men who had followed him during the chaos of the Ho Jing rebellion. They weren't blue-blooded nobles, they were tested survivors. Qin rewarded them with posts as provincial governors and military inspectors, trusting them to keep order in volatile regions. These appointments bound them to him personally, but they also created a risk. The stronger his generals became, the more they resembled semi-independent warlords. The Qin dynasty lived in constant tension between central command and regional autonomy. Soldiers themselves came from diverse backgrounds. Some were peasants conscripted for service, balancing farm work with military duty. Others were professional fighters, hardened veterans who had served under multiple banners as dynasties rose and fell. Still others were opportunists, men who saw soldiering as a path to food, shelter, and perhaps a scrap of glory. Their loyalty wasn't automatic. It had to be earned with regular rations, fair leadership, and the sense that their sacrifices mattered. Chen's early reputation for sharing hardships with his troops helped build that trust. Later rulers, more comfortable in palaces than on battlefields, struggled to maintain it. One of the Qin dynasty's enduring challenges was the aristocracy's disdain for military service. In the South, civil refinement had long been prized over martial valor. Poetry and calligraphy elevated status, not swords. That meant generals often came from families of lesser birth, while high-ranking civil offices remained the playground of old clans. This divide created a cultural rift in governance. Military men who actually held power in the provinces often lacked the aristocratic polish needed to dominate court politics, while refined nobles in Jiankong looked down on the very soldiers who kept them safe. Qin emperors had to balance these groups carefully, relying on military men without alienating the aristocrats who legitimized their rule. Training and discipline varied widely. In Jiankang and other core regions, troops drilled regularly, maintaining a semblance of professional readiness. On the frontiers, however, garrisons often devolved into semi-autonomous bands, supplementing their meager rations by extorting locals. The difference between a soldier and a bandit could be razor-thin, and local people sometimes treated both with equal fear. This blurred line between protection and predation haunted the Qin military throughout its short existence. Despite these flaws, the Qin military had moments of brilliance. River ambushes, fortified defenses along the Huai, and clever use of terrain allowed smaller forces to blunt northern offensives. Generals like Ho Andu and Su Ling, loyal to the founding emperor, became household names for their ability to outmaneuver stronger foes. These men weren't just soldiers, they were pillars of the dynasty, their reputations carrying as much weight as any official decree. But here lay another danger. When generals hold that much prestige, emperors have to wonder whether loyalty will endure beyond personal ties. And loyalty, in truth, was fragile. Chen Baxian's own rise had proven that generals could topple dynasties. Everyone knew it. His successors would have to live under the same shadow. The paradox of the Chen dynasty was that it relied on strong generals to survive, yet feared that those same generals might one day repeat Chen Baxian's climb and seize the throne themselves. In that sense, the army was both shield and sword, protector and potential executioner. The rank and file also carried stories of hardship. Imagine a peasant conscripted into service, plucked from his fields during planting season to guard a river fortress. He spends months staring across the water at northern patrols, his family struggling at home without his labor. Or picture a veteran who's fought under 3 banners in his lifetime, weary of war but unable to escape it because soldiering is all he knows. These were the human faces of the Chen army, not just nameless troops, but men caught between survival and duty. So when we talk about the Chen military structure, it isn't just about organization charts or battle formations. It's about the delicate balance between central authority and regional commanders, the reliance on rivers over cavalry, the social gap between aristocrats and soldiers, and the constant, gnawing question of loyalty. Without its generals, the Chen dynasty would have collapsed in its infancy. With them, it stood tall enough to be remembered, but never tall enough to escape the shadow of fragility. For all his grit and pragmatism, Chen Baxian was mortal. By the time he had stabilized his dynasty barely, but enough to matter, his body was already showing the toll of decades in armor, endless campaigns, and the strain of ruling a fractured state. He had risen to the throne in his 50s, older than most soldiers ever lived to be, and the years weighed heavily. In 559, just 2 years after proclaiming himself emperor, Chen Baxian fell ill. It was sudden, but not entirely surprising. The dynasty he had carved out of chaos now faced the greatest challenge any new regime confronts, surviving its founder's death. Here's the thing about founders: they're often larger than life. They hold power not just because of their position, but because of their personal authority, the way they command loyalty through presence, reputation, and charisma. Once they're gone, the machinery they leave behind is rarely strong enough to stand on its own. That was the predicament the Chen dynasty faced in 559. Chen Baxian's designated heir was his nephew, Chen Qian, who became emperor when of Qin. Why a nephew, not a son? Because Chen's own sons were either too young or otherwise unsuitable, and the court, shaped by military realities, needed someone with experience and maturity to step in quickly. Succession through nephews wasn't unusual in Chinese dynastic history, especially in times of crisis. But it always carried risks: rival claimants, jealous factions, and the inevitable question of whether loyalty to the founder would transfer seamlessly to his successor. The transition, surprisingly, went smoother than many expected. Chen Qian had already proven himself in military and administrative roles, and crucially, he had the backing of powerful generals who had served under Chen Baxian. Men like Hou Andu and Su Ling, whose swords had secured the dynasty in the first place, recognized that unity mattered more than personal ambition at this fragile moment. Their support kept the succession from devolving into the kind of bloody palace coup that had ended so many dynasties before. But smooth doesn't mean easy. Emperor Wen faced immediate challenges. First, he had to project continuity, that the dynasty hadn't lost its spine with Chen Baxian's death. He framed his accession as the natural extension of his uncle's will, emphasizing stability, order, and the preservation of the dynasty's legitimacy. Rituals played a key role here. Elaborate mourning ceremonies for the late emperor not only honored Chen Baxian, but also reminded everyone that the dynasty, fragile though it was, now had a lineage. Dynastic continuity was as much about symbolism as about armies. Second, Wen had to win over the aristocracy, many of whom had barely tolerated Chen Baxian's rule. A nephew was easier for them to swallow than one of Chen's young sons, but he still needed to demonstrate refinement and competence. Wen was more scholarly than his uncle, better able to converse in the language of Confucian statecraft, and he leaned into that. If Chen Baxian had been the rugged founder, Wen styled himself as the consolidator, less a man of war, more a man of order. Still, the shadow of Chen Baxian lingered. His death left many wondering whether the dynasty would collapse without the iron will of its founder. Soldiers whispered about whether one could command them as his uncle had. Aristocrats wondered if he had the backbone to stand up to ambitious generals. Northern rivals surely watched with interest, sensing weakness. In moments like this, even rumors could topple regimes. That the Chen Dynasty held together after 559 was not inevitable. It was the product of careful management, loyalty networks, and the sheer exhaustion of a population that wanted peace more than another warlord's struggle. There's also a human dimension worth pausing on. Imagine being one of Chen Baxian's old comrades, men who had fought beside him through rebellion, betrayal, and conquest. Suddenly, their leader, the man who had shared their rations, laughed with them in tents, and led them through storms, was gone. Now they were expected to pledge that same loyalty to a new emperor, one who hadn't bled with them on the battlefield in quite the same way. Did they feel grief? Resentment? Perhaps both. Transitions are never purely political. They're emotional, too. And those emotions often simmer beneath the surface of court politics. In hindsight, Chen Baxian's death so early in the dynasty's life may have been a strange blessing as well as a curse. Because he died before he could alienate his generals or overextend his resources, he left behind a foundation that was fragile but unbroken. Had he lingered and stumbled in old age, the dynasty might have fractured more violently. Instead, his death created a moment for Emperor Wen to step in and give the Qin house a second wind. Of course, none of this erased the fundamental truth. The Qin dynasty was still a small, precarious state hemmed in by stronger neighbors. But succession crises were the downfall of many dynasties, and the fact that Qin survived its first one was no small feat. It meant that the Qin were more than just a one-man show. They had the beginnings of a system, however fragile, that could outlive their founder. If you picture it in cinematic terms, think of the scene, Jiankang draped in mourning banners, the founder's coffin carried through streets still scarred by rebellion, courtiers bowing low not just in grief, but in calculation. And then, in the palace, a new emperor sits on the dragon throne, not the grizzled soldier who built the dynasty, but his nephew, younger, more refined, yet untested. Outside the walls, generals shift in their saddles, waiting to see if this new ruler can hold the line. That was the Qin dynasty in 559. Fragile, anxious, but still standing. Every dynasty seems to have that one ruler whose name becomes shorthand for its decline. For the Qin dynasty, that figure was Qin Shi Bao, better known as Emperor Hozhu, the last lord. His reign, 582 to 589, was the dynasty's swan song, remembered less for stability or reform and more for indulgence, excess, and fatal blindness to the threats gathering on the horizon. But before we condemn him outright, it's worth remembering the context. By the time Qin Shi Bao ascended the throne, the dynasty was already fragile. Decades of scraping by had drained the treasury, provincial governors were restless, and the great northern power of the Sui had just consolidated its rule, welding together the strength of Zhou and Qi into a juggernaut. Even a cautious, pragmatic ruler would have struggled. Shi Bao, unfortunately, was not cautious. He came to the throne young, inheriting power after Emperor Xian's death. Xian had been a vigorous, if erratic ruler, but Shi Bao lacked his uncle's edge. What he did have was charm, taste, and an almost obsessive love of luxury. He turned the Jiankang court into a theater of indulgence, commissioning grand palaces filled with ornate gardens, jeweled halls, and banquet chambers where music and poetry flowed late into the night. He surrounded himself with poets, courtiers, and concubines, basking in refined pleasures while the state teetered on shaky ground. His court became infamous for extravagance. Stories tell of pools filled with wine, halls hung with silks, and performances staged with such splendor that even aristocrats accustomed to southern elegance were dazzled. Concubines like Zheng Lihua became legendary, not just for their beauty but for the political sway they wielded. Zheng in particular was said to have influenced Shi Bao deeply, her words shaping court decisions as much as ministers' advice. Whether these tales are exaggerated by later historians writing under the Sui and Tang, who loved to vilify fallen dynasties, or grounded in truth, the perception stuck. Xu Bao was a ruler distracted by pleasure. Meanwhile, the machinery of government rusted. Officials jockeyed for favor rather than serving the people. Corruption spread, tax burdens grew heavier, and soldiers went unpaid. Where Chen Baxian had once inspired loyalty by sharing his men's hardships, Xu Bao inspired ridicule by retreating into his palaces. The common people, already strained by floods, famine, and taxation, saw little relief. To them, the emperor might as well have been living in a different world altogether. What's striking about Xu Bao is that he wasn't untalented. He wrote poetry, appreciated the arts, and possessed the charisma of a cultured southern ruler. In another time, perhaps in a dynasty already rich and stable, he might have been remembered as a patron of culture. But in the 580s, what the Qin needed was grit, not refinement. While the Sui Emperor Yang Jian, later Emperor Wen of Sui, was unifying the north with iron discipline, Xu Bao was writing poems to his concubines. It's a contrast so stark it almost reads like satire. His failure wasn't simply personal indulgence, it was also blindness to geopolitical reality. By the late 580s, the Sui dynasty had already demonstrated its military strength, absorbing northern Qi and crushing rivals with brutal efficiency. Envoys brought word of Sui's growing power, yet Xu Bao underestimated the danger. He assumed, as southern rulers often had, that the Yangtze would shield him and that the Sui would be too busy with northern consolidation to march south. It was a miscalculation of deadly proportions. Within his court, factionalism flourished. Ministers split into cliques, some warning of the Sui threat, others assuring the emperor that peace could be bought with diplomacy. Xu Bao often sided with the flatterers. Zhang Lihua, portrayed by later chroniclers as a femme fatale, became the symbol of this indulgent court, though in truth, she was probably more scapegoat than villain, her influence exaggerated to explain away the emperor's own failings. Still, the image of an emperor bewitched by beauty while ignoring statecraft was irresistible to later historians, and it cemented Xu Bao's reputation as a cautionary tale. To ordinary people, Xu Bao's reign was marked by neglect. Taxes rose to pay for palace construction, while defenses along the Huai and Yangtze were underfunded. Banditry re-emerged in rural areas, and soldiers grumbled as supplies dwindled. The army, once the dynasty's shield, weakened into a brittle shell. When Xu Bao did pay attention to military matters, it was often too late, his orders reactive rather than strategic. And yet, even in decline, Xu Bao's court glittered. Poetry and music thrived, calligraphers honed their art, and festivals dazzled the capital. Jiankang, in those years, must have been a strange place, outwardly splendid, filled with song and color, but inwardly hollow, its foundations crumbling. The court danced, wrote verses, and toasted to beauty, even as the dynasty edged closer to collapse. It's tempting to paint Xu Bao as a fool, and to some extent, history has done just that. But his reign also reflects a deeper truth about human nature. When faced with overwhelming pressures, stronger enemies, fragile institutions, endless crises, some rulers respond with discipline, others with despair, and some with escape into pleasure. Xu Bao's tragedy was that his escape became the defining mark of his reign. He wasn't simply a weak emperor, he was the wrong emperor at the wrong time. By the late 580s, the Chen Dynasty was living on borrowed time. Its founders' discipline and its early reforms had bought it 3 decades, but those gains were squandered under Xu Bao. The Sui watched, patient and calculating, waiting for the right moment to strike. Inside Jiankang, the emperor wrote love poems to his concubines and reveled in palace splendor. Outside, the dynasty's enemies sharpened their swords. Dynasties don't just collapse because of enemies outside their borders. Often, the decay begins within. Under Xu Bao, the Qin court became less a council of governance and more a stage for intrigue, ambition, and whispered conspiracies. Ministers, generals, concubines, and aristocrats all maneuvered for influence, and the emperor, distracted, indulgent, and often indecisive, let those rivalries fester until they shaped the very fate of his reign. The first and most infamous name tied to these intrigues was Zhang Lihua, Xu Bao's beloved concubine. Later histories, written under the sway and tang, turned her into the archetype of the seductive courtesan who toppled a dynasty. They described her as dazzlingly beautiful, clever, and utterly in control of the emperor's heart. She allegedly persuaded Xu Bao to elevate her family, to appoint her favorites, and to ignore competent ministers who criticized her influence. Was this entirely fair? Probably not. Historians have long scapegoated women at collapsing courts. Think of Daji in the Shang, Yang Guifei in the Tang. In truth, Zheng Lihua's influence reflected the emperor's weakness more than her villainy. But perception mattered, and the court perceived her as a rival center of power. Around her, factions formed. Officials who sought favor with the emperor often courted Zheng Lihua's approval, offering bribes or poetry in her honor. Those who opposed her influence found themselves sidelined, their petitions ignored. The court, instead of focusing on military defense or economic relief, became consumed with palace politics. Who was in, who was out, who whispered in the emperor's ear last night. It was a dangerous game of shadows, one that drained energy from governing at a time when the dynasty could least afford it. Meanwhile, the generals who had once held the dynasty together grew restless. Many had been stationed in provincial strongholds, their soldiers unpaid, their loyalty strained. Some demanded greater recognition at court, others were suspected of plotting rebellion. Ministers warned Xu Bao about their ambitions, but he often dismissed these concerns or tried to buy loyalty with empty titles rather than real resources. Distrust deepened on both sides. The emperor feared the generals, and the generals feared being discarded once their usefulness ran out. This mutual suspicion created an atmosphere where betrayal seemed almost inevitable. Aristocratic clans also played their part. The great families of the South had tolerated Qin rule but never truly embraced it. To them, Xu Bao's court was a chance to reassert their dominance, to secure offices for their sons and advantages for their estates. They whispered against rivals, blocked reforms that threatened their privileges, and treated the state as a bargaining chip in their own rivalries. If the emperor was weak, they would be strong, and so the machinery of government slowed under the weight of their self-interest. All of this fed into a culture of paranoia. Ministers spied on one another, generals suspected plots in every command, and the emperor himself oscillated between indulgent trust in flatterers and sudden bursts of suspicion toward competent but blunt advisors. Some who dared to speak frankly about the sway threat were dismissed or punished, their warnings buried under layers of courtly flattery. Xu Bao preferred to be soothed rather than alarmed, and so many courtiers learned quickly to tell him what he wanted to hear. The intrigues weren't just political, they seeped into rituals and daily life. Promotions and demotions could hinge on a concubine's whim, on whether a poem pleased the emperor, or on whether a rival had whispered the right slander at the right moment. Imagine being a mid-level official, trying to push through a policy to repair dikes or raise grain supplies, only to see your efforts sabotaged because someone in Zheng Lihua's circle decided you had insulted them at a banquet. That was the atmosphere of Qin Xu Bao's Jiankang, glittering on the surface, poisonous underneath. And while courtiers played these games, the people outside the palace walls paid the price. Taxes grew heavier to fund endless luxuries, while defenses crumbled. Soldiers muttered about shortages, farmers abandoned fields under the weight of levies, and banditry returned to the countryside. The very foundation of Qin power, the ability to provide stability and security, was eroding. But inside the palace, that reality felt distant. Musicians still played, poets still performed, and courtiers still schemed. The irony is that the Chen Dynasty's court intrigues weren't even especially dramatic compared to the bloody coups of other dynasties. There weren't rivers of blood in the palace halls, no mass purges or massacres. Instead, the intrigues were quieter, subtler, 1,000 small cuts rather than one decisive blow. That's what made them so corrosive. By the time the Sui prepared their final assault, the Qin were so consumed by internal rivalries that they couldn't mount a unified defense. If you picture Jiankang during Xu Bao's reign, imagine two parallel worlds. In one, courtiers in silk robes whisper, scheme, and bow before Zheng Lihua's favored circle, their fates decided by intrigue rather than competence. In the other, just beyond the palace walls, farmers struggle with famine, soldiers drill with half-empty stores, and northern scouts test the edges of the Yangtze. The tragedy is that these two worlds barely touched. The palace lived in illusion while the provinces braced for reality. While Chen Shubao and his court busied themselves with poetry, banquets, and intrigue, the empire's northern neighbor was quietly becoming something terrifying, unified, disciplined, and hungry. The Sui dynasty, founded in 581 by Yang Jian, later emperor one of Sui, had accomplished in a handful of years what the south hadn't managed in generations. It had welded together the remnants of northern Zhou, absorbed the territories of northern Qi, and restored a semblance of unity to the north. For the first time in decades, the Qin faced not two rival wolves snapping at each other's throats, but a single predator, focused and organized, staring directly across the river. The contrast between north and south couldn't have been starker. In the north, Sui engineers were already repairing infrastructure, dredging canals, and tightening control over taxation. Their armies, hardened by campaigns against Qi and steppe tribes, were professional and disciplined, with supply lines capable of sustaining long campaigns. Their cavalry roamed the plains with terrifying efficiency, while infantry and siege units gave them flexibility against fortified defenses. Yang Jian himself was shrewd and methodical, more than willing to wait until his enemies weakened themselves before striking. In the south, by contrast, Qin defenses sagged. The Yangtze still served as a natural barrier, but the fortresses along the Huai, the buffer zone between Sui and Qin, had fallen into disrepair. Soldiers complained of late pay and dwindling rations. Some commanders were more loyal to their own clans than to the dynasty. And while Qin generals could still mount effective skirmishes and ambushes, they no longer had the resources or morale for prolonged campaigns. In a direct clash, everyone knew the south would struggle. The psychological pressure was immense. News trickled into Jiankang of Sui victories in the north, of entire provinces brought under their control, of rivals crushed with efficiency the Qin could only envy. Merchants traveling across borders spoke of Sui's wealth, its bustling markets, its reformed administration. Even in the south, whispers began. Perhaps the mandate of heaven had shifted. Perhaps the Sui were destined to reunify China. Such rumors were as dangerous as any sword, because belief often shapes reality. Border villages felt this pressure most directly. Along the Huai River, peasants lived in a kind of permanent limbo, claimed by Chen on one day, raided by Sui forces the next. They planted crops knowing they might be trampled by whichever army passed through. Their loyalty was fluid, often pragmatic. Whoever could protect them, they obeyed. For these people, dynastic politics wasn't about legitimacy or ritual, it was about survival. And increasingly, survival seemed to follow the Sui banners. Chen Shubao's response to this growing threat was tragically inadequate. Advisors urged him to strengthen river defenses, to invest in the navy, to reform the army's pay. Instead, he often delayed, distracted by court pleasures or lulled by flatterers who insisted the Yangtze would keep the Sui at bay. When he did act, it was reactive, patchwork measures rather than comprehensive strategy. Fortresses received occasional repairs, generals were shuffled from one province to another, but nothing addressed the core weaknesses of the dynasty. Meanwhile, the Sui were preparing meticulously. They didn't rush into war, they consolidated. They reorganized the north, secured borders with steppe tribes, and built supply networks capable of sustaining a campaign across the river. They were patient, and patience is lethal when combined with overwhelming resources. To Qin ministers who saw the danger clearly, it was like watching a storm build on the horizon while the emperor insisted the skies were clear. What made the situation even more precarious was that the Chen Dynasty didn't just face pressure from the Sui, it also faced internal fraying because of that pressure. Generals stationed along the border grew resentful of the court's neglect. Soldiers deserted or turned to banditry. Local populations, squeezed by taxation to fund half-hearted defenses, sometimes sided with northern raiders who at least offered predictability. The Qin state, meant to protect its people, was increasingly seen as a burden. By the late 580s, the writing was on the wall. The Sui were united, confident, and waiting for their moment. The Chen were divided, distracted, and drifting toward collapse. It wasn't just that the Sui were strong, it was that the Chen had become weak. Borders are never defended by rivers alone. They're defended by will, organization, and the belief that the state is worth fighting for. By Xu Bao's reign, that belief had eroded. If you picture it visually, imagine the map of China around 588, the north a solid block of Sui blue, stretching across the plains, while the south is a small, frayed patch hugging the lower Yangtze. To the casual eye, it already looks like an inevitability. The larger shape will eventually swallow the smaller. And yet, inside Jiankang, the court still staged banquets, still composed verses, still convinced itself that rivers and walls would hold. The storm was gathering, and the Chen were pretending it was a breeze. Politics and armies might have been the surface of the Chen story, but underneath it all lay the economy, the slow, grinding reality of fields, taxes, and trade. And here's the truth. The South was rich in potential, but under the Chen, that wealth was never fully realized. What might have been the dynasty's greatest strength turned into a fragile patchwork, stretched thin and uneven, leaving the state constantly one bad harvest away from disaster. The lower Yangtze and surrounding provinces were among the most fertile lands in China. Rice paddies stretched across the flatlands, sustained by complex irrigation systems and the monsoon cycle. Farmers coaxed multiple harvests a year from their fields, and local markets bustled with grain, fish, timber, and silk. In theory, this agricultural base should have made the Chen dynasty resilient. But theory doesn't always match practice. The devastation of the Hojing rebellion still lingered, abandoned fields, broken dikes, and entire villages depopulated. Recovery was slow, uneven, and fragile. Taxation was the crux of Chen governance and its Achilles heel. On paper, the system followed established models: households registered, land measured, levies assessed in grain, cloth, or labor. In reality, the burden fell hardest on those least able to bear it. Aristocratic clans used their influence to shield estates from full taxation, hiding land under falsified registers or shifting burdens onto tenant farmers. Smallholders, lacking protection, were squeezed until many abandoned their plots entirely. These displaced peasants drifted toward cities, refugee camps, or bandit bands, eroding the state's tax base even further. The Qin government tried to plug these holes. Inspectors were dispatched to audit local registers, land was occasionally confiscated from evasive landlords, and abandoned plots were redistributed. But these measures were band-aids. The aristocracy remained too powerful, corruption too ingrained. For every field the government managed to tax properly, another slipped through the cracks. The result was a treasury that looked solid on paper but felt empty in practice. Trade should have been another pillar of stability. The South's rivers and coastlines made it a natural hub for commerce, linking inland rice fields to coastal markets and beyond to maritime routes stretching towards Southeast Asia. Jiankang itself had once been a thriving metropolis of merchants and artisans. Under the Qin, however, political instability and heavy taxation stifled trade. Merchants faced bandit attacks on overland routes, pirates along the coast, and arbitrary levies at checkpoints. Some still prospered, but many shifted their business northward, toward the more stable and unified Sui markets. The South, once a vibrant commercial engine, began to sputter. Floods and famine compounded the strain. The Yangtze, both a lifeline and a menace, periodically burst its banks, destroying harvests and leaving thousands homeless. In bad years, famine spread, forcing desperate families to sell children into servitude or flee their homes. Relief from the state was minimal. Granaries often stood empty, their reserves diverted to feed soldiers or fund the emperor's luxuries. For common people, the dynasty's promise of protection rang hollow when hunger stalked their villages. The economic gap between palace and peasantry widened dangerously. Inside Jiankang, Emperor Xu Bao spent lavishly on palaces, banquets, and performances. Outside the capital, peasants groaned under levies they could barely pay. Soldiers, too, felt the pinch, their stipends delayed or reduced. Hungry armies are dangerous armies, and murmurs of desertion or rebellion spread whenever pay was late. The economy wasn't just about numbers, it was about morale, and morale was crumbling. Interestingly, the Chen did maintain some bright spots. Southern artisans, especially in silk weaving, lacquerware, and ceramics, continued to produce fine goods. Temples and monasteries, funded by donations and tax exemptions, often became centers of economic activity in their own right, organizing land, trade, and relief. In some ways, Buddhism filled the gaps left by the state, feeding the poor, redistributing alms, and offering stability where the government faltered. But while temples provided charity, they also drained taxable land from the state, another irony of Chen's reliance on religion for legitimacy. The economic realities of the South, then, were a story of contradiction. Fertile land, but fragile recovery. Rich trade routes, but weakened markets. Palatial wealth, but popular hardship. The Chen Dynasty survived on just enough revenue to pay for soldiers, rituals, and extravagance, but not enough to build long-term strength. And when the Sui began preparing their invasion, those cracks widened into chasms. Armies need grain, ships need timber, soldiers need pay, and the Chen economy could no longer keep up. If you imagine it, think of the South in the late 580s like a house built on a floodplain. The walls look fine, the roof still stands, but the foundation is soft and waterlogged. The family inside might pretend all is well, hosting banquets and singing songs, but sooner or later the ground gives way. That was the Chen economy, outwardly fertile, inwardly fragile, and fatally unprepared for the storm about to hit. For all the grandeur of court rituals and the intrigues of generals, the real weight of any dynasty rests on the shoulders of peasants. In the Chen Dynasty, as in so many others, it was farmers who planted the rice, dug the canals, and paid the taxes that kept the state alive. And it was also farmers who bore the heaviest burdens when that state began to falter. The life of a Chen peasant was dictated by the rhythm of the land. Rice cultivation dominated the fertile lowlands of the Yangtze, where families worked knee-deep in flooded paddies, bending hour after hour under the sun. In upland regions, millet and wheat supplemented diets, alongside vegetables, fish, and the occasional bit of pork. These were communities built on labor and resilience, but their stability was fragile. A flood, a drought, or a bandit raid could erase a year's effort overnight. And when the state demanded its share on top of those hardships, survival became a daily negotiation. Taxes were the central strain. Officially, the Qin government inherited the liang system of assessing households based on land and labor. Each registered family owed grain, cloth, or corvée service, weeks or months of unpaid labor on state projects, like repairing dikes or building roads. In theory, this system was designed to distribute burdens fairly. In practice, powerful clans found loopholes, registering land under dependent peasants to reduce their liability, while common farmers found themselves squeezed for more than their share. For a smallholder family, the math rarely balanced. After setting aside enough rice to feed themselves, they still had to meet tax quotas. A poor harvest meant selling tools, livestock, or even family members into servitude just to pay levies. Some abandoned their farms altogether, fleeing to the forests or mountains where they joined bandit groups or attached themselves to monasteries for protection. Every peasant who slipped through the cracks meant fewer taxes for the state, which in turn pushed officials to squeeze those who remained even harder. It was a vicious cycle, and one the Qin never managed to break. Corruption made things worse. Local magistrates, often poorly paid themselves, skimmed grain and silver from collections. Soldiers sent to protect villages sometimes extorted farmers instead. Imagine being a peasant, watching your carefully harvested rice disappear into the granaries of officials, knowing full well that only a portion would ever reach the capital. Resentment simmered, though open rebellion remained rare. Most peasants were too exhausted to rise up. They grumbled, endured, and looked to heaven for justice when earthly rulers failed them. Religion offered some solace. Buddhist monasteries in particular became sanctuaries for peasants crushed by taxation. Monks distributed food during famines, provided loans, and sometimes sheltered fugitives from conscription. Of course, this meant monasteries accumulated land and resources, further shrinking the state's tax base. But for peasants, they were lifelines. Taoist rituals also played a role, offering blessings for harvests and protection against floods. In times of desperation, families might scrape together coins to pay for a temple ceremony, hoping to turn fate in their favor. Daily life was not all hardship. Seasonal festivals, tied to agricultural cycles, gave peasants moments of joy. Lanterns lit up village squares during the new year, music and dance accompanied planting rituals, and local storytelling traditions passed history and folklore from one generation to the next. These cultural rhythms helped people endure the grind of taxation and labor. But the underlying reality never changed. Their backs bent under the twin weights of nature and the state. By the late 580s, as the Qin court grew more extravagant, peasants felt the burden intensify. More taxes, more corvée demands, fewer returns. Soldiers requisitioned grain, floods destroyed crops, and officials still came knocking. Some villages simply emptied, families packed what little they had and vanished into the hills, abandoning land the state could no longer tax. Each empty farm was a quiet rebellion, a silent indictment of the dynasty's failure to protect its people. And here lies one of the central tragedies of the Chen Dynasty. While emperors and courtiers recited poetry in gilded halls, the people who sustained them were pushed to breaking. Dynasties don't fall just because of invading armies, they fall because their own foundations crumble. And the Qin foundation was its peasants. Exhausted, overtaxed, and underprotected, they had little left to give. When the Sui armies came, many peasants saw them not as conquerors but as a chance for change. After all, what loyalty does a farmer owe to a ruler who lets his children starve? If you want to picture the Qin dynasty from below, imagine a family of 5 in a riverside village. The father bent over the fields, the mother weaving cloth to meet tax quotas, children carrying water from the canal. The harvest is meager after a flood, but the tax collector arrives anyway, flanked by soldiers. The family hands over half their grain, knowing the winter will be lean. That evening, as the emperor toasts poets in Jiankang, this family boils thin porridge and wonders if they'll survive the year. That was the Qin dynasty, too, not just palaces, but patties. And in the end, it was the patties that told the truth. In a dynasty as fragile as the Qin, religion wasn't just personal belief, it was a political lifeline. When armies faltered, when granaries emptied, when legitimacy wavered, emperors leaned on the temples and altars of their world. And in 6th century southern China, 2 great spiritual forces dominated, Buddhism and Taoism. Each offered something different, and each left deep imprints on the short life of the Qin dynasty. Buddhism, already centuries old in China by the time of Qin, was flourishing in the south. The chaos of the Liang and the devastation of Ho Jing's rebellion had made its message of suffering and salvation resonate deeply with ordinary people. Monasteries sprouted across the lower Yangtze, their tiled roofs rising above ruined villages as symbols of resilience. Monks translated sutras, built statues, and preached to crowds weary of war. For peasants overtaxed and soldiers weary of endless campaigns, Buddhism's promise of karmic balance and rebirth offered a kind of hope no emperor could guarantee. Qin rulers recognized this power. They patronized temples, donated land, and sponsored the copying of scriptures. These gestures weren't purely pious, they were also strategic. By presenting themselves as Dharma kings, rulers who protected the Buddhist faith, Qin emperors sought legitimacy that aristocratic bloodlines alone couldn't give them. Temples, in return, prayed for the dynasty's longevity, staged grand ceremonies to honor the throne, and provided social services that softened the state's failures. In a sense, Buddhism became a partner in governance, filling gaps the government couldn't. But there was a cost. Land granted to monasteries often slipped out of the tax system, draining revenue from the state. Critics at court argued that temples were growing too rich and too independent, shielding peasants from obligations that the government desperately needed to enforce. Yet emperors rarely dared to push back hard. The faith was too popular, too embedded. To attack monasteries was to risk alienating both the people and heaven itself. So the Qin court tolerated and even encouraged Buddhism's growing power, even as it eroded the fiscal base of the dynasty. Taoism offered a different kind of influence, one rooted less in salvation and more in harmony with cosmic forces. Taoist priests performed rituals to ward off floods, epidemics, and plagues, all common threats in the humid south. Their ceremonies promised not just protection but legitimacy. If floods receded after a ritual, who could doubt that the emperor had heaven's favor? The Qin emperors, aware of this, often consulted Taoist masters for guidance, especially during crises. In the palace, Taoist texts were studied alongside Confucian classics, shaping the intellectual climate of the court. Taoism also appealed to the aristocracy, who had long cultivated an image of refinement through the pursuit of immortality, alchemy, and philosophical retreat. A southern gentleman could host a poetry gathering by day and a Taoist ritual by night, blending culture and spirituality into one seamless identity. This alignment between Taoism and elite culture gave it a different weight than Buddhism, which was more popular among commoners. Together, the two traditions bridged the social divide. Taoism dignified the elite, while Buddhism consoled the masses. The coexistence of Buddhism and Taoism wasn't always peaceful. Monks and priests competed for patronage, each claiming their rituals were more effective, their teachings more essential. The Qin court, however, balanced them carefully, playing mediator when necessary. In a way, this balancing act mirrored the dynasty itself, fragile, precarious, trying to hold together competing forces that threatened to pull it apart. For ordinary people, religion was woven into daily life. Farmers might leave offerings at a roadside shrine before planting, monks might wander villages chanting sutras, Taoist healers might be called during epidemics. The state's legitimacy mattered little to them compared to whether prayers kept their children healthy or their crops alive. But in supporting both Buddhism and Taoism, the Chen Dynasty positioned itself as the guardian of cosmic order, a role every Chinese dynasty claimed, but one the Qin especially needed, given their shaky political footing. By the final years of the dynasty, as the Sui threat loomed larger, rituals multiplied. Temples staged grand ceremonies to ward off invasion, monks and priests prayed for heaven's intervention, and the court clung to omens that promised survival. But no prayer could stop what was coming. Religion could soothe, legitimize, and inspire, but it couldn't replace soldiers, grain, or strategy. The Qin dynasty's faith may have offered comfort, but it couldn't hold back the tide of history. If you want to picture it, imagine Jiankang on a summer evening in the 580s, the emperor dining in a candlelit hall, Taoist priests performing rituals in the palace courtyard, monks chanting sutras in temples along the river. Incense smoke drifts through the capital, rising toward heaven, carrying the desperate hopes of a dynasty on the edge. Faith filled the air, but faith alone was not enough. One of the most stubborn problems Qin rulers faced was that their dynasty was small, fragile, and in many ways more a patchwork of provinces than a unified state. Jiankang might have been the capital, with its palaces, temples, and rituals, but the lifeblood of the dynasty lay in the provinces: fertile Jiangnan fields, coastal trade hubs, inland river valleys. And here was the rub: those provinces often answered more to local commanders or aristocratic families than to the emperor in Jiankang. The Qin dynasty never fully solved the tug-of-war between central authority and regional autonomy. From the beginning, Qin emperors relied on generals to secure power in the provinces. Men like Ho Andu and Su Ling, veterans of the Ho Jing rebellion, had been given governorships and command over garrisons to keep restive regions in check. On paper, they answered to the throne. In practice, they commanded armies, collected taxes, and dispensed justice with a degree of independence that made them little kings in their own right. Qin Baxian himself had risen this way, carving out regional power before claiming the throne, and everyone knew it could happen again. The dynasty's greatest strength, its generals, was also its greatest vulnerability. The aristocratic clans deepened this problem. Families like the Shin and the Wang controlled vast estates in Jiangnan. They provided administrators, scholars, and ministers, but they also ran their domains with near-sovereign authority. Peasants on their estates owed loyalty to the family as much as to the state. When taxes were levied, aristocrats often collected them and decided how much would actually reach Jiankang. Sometimes they complied, other times they shielded their tenants. The emperor could scold them, but without soldiers to enforce decrees, scolding only went so far. This left the Qin emperors in a bind. Push too hard against regional power and risk rebellion. Push too little and watch the center hollow out. Emperor Wen, Qin Baxian's successor, managed this balance carefully, appointing loyalists to key provinces and rotating generals before they grew too entrenched. But under Qin Shi Bao, the system frayed. Neglect from the capital allowed provincial leaders to tighten their grip. Some acted as if they were semi-independent states, responding to imperial edicts selectively, if at all. For common people, this meant governance varied wildly depending on where they lived. In some provinces, competent governors kept order, repaired canals, and ensured reasonable taxation. In others, corruption flourished, soldiers extorted villages, and aristocrats hoarded grain. The Chen Dynasty wasn't a uniform experience, it was a patchwork quilt, stitched together with uneven thread. This decentralization also weakened defense. When the Sui began preparing for invasion, the Qin court needed unified coordination, armies mobilized together, supplies pooled, strategies aligned. Instead, generals squabbled, governors hesitated, and aristocrats balked at surrendering resources. Each region guarded its own survival, but few prioritized the dynasty as a whole. By the late 580s, the Qin state resembled less a single organism than a collection of limbs loosely connected to a weary heart. It's easy to see why. The dynasty had never had the wealth or manpower to enforce strong central control. Unlike the Han or the Tang, the Qin lacked the ability to overwhelm aristocrats or march large armies into defiant provinces. Their power was always negotiated, never absolute. The very men they empowered to hold the dynasty together also ensured it could never fully centralize. It was a trap with no clear escape. If you want to picture it, imagine a map of the Qin dynasty at night, Jiankang lit brightly at the center, but beyond it, the glow fades into patches of light controlled by generals, governors, and clans. Some are bright and loyal, others dim and self-serving. The lines between them are blurred, and when the storm of the Sui comes, those patches will flicker and die one by one, leaving Jiankang exposed. The Chen dynasty's fate was sealed as much by this internal looseness as by any external invasion. An empire divided in its loyalties cannot stand forever. The Sui didn't have to destroy a monolithic state, they only had to push over a collection of loosely bound pieces. The tragedy is that everyone in Jiankang must have known this, yet no one could stop the unraveling. If the Chen dynasty had one military ace to play, it was the Yangtze River. Wide, fast-moving, and treacherous to cross, the river was the South's greatest natural barrier. No northern cavalry charge could leap its waters, no siege engine could simply roll across. For centuries, southern dynasties had relied on the Yangtze as their wall, and the Qin continued that tradition. But a wall is only as strong as the soldiers who guard it, and by the late 6th century, the Qin navy and river defenses were straining under neglect. From the start, Qin rulers invested heavily in ships. Unlike their northern rivals, whose armies thrived on open plains and horse-mounted cavalry, the Qin military was built for riverine warfare. War junks with raised decks and armored hulls patrolled the Yangtze, ferrying troops quickly to reinforce threatened banks. Smaller, agile boats darted through tributaries, ambushing raiders or intercepting supply barges. Control of the river wasn't just about stopping invasions, it was about keeping the empire's arteries flowing, ensuring grain from the fertile south reached Jiankang and other garrisons. The navy also served as a psychological shield. For the people of Jiankang, the sight of warships on the Yangtze reassured them that their dynasty was safe behind the heavenly moat. As long as the navy held, they believed, no northern power could breach the south. That confidence, however, bred complacency. By Chen Shubao's reign, the navy was underfunded, its ships aging, its crews unpaid. Some vessels rotted at their moorings, others sailed with skeleton crews. A few competent commanders tried to hold standards high, but without consistent support from the capital, discipline faltered. Still, the navy wasn't to be underestimated. Even in decline, Qin forces could mount effective ambushes. Northern troops attempting to cross the Huai or Yangtze faced sudden attacks by swift southern boats, their rafts shattered, their soldiers drowned in the current. More than once, small Qin flotillas turned back larger invasions simply by striking at the right moment. But these victories were defensive, short-lived, and costly. They bought time, not security. Fortifications along the river added another layer. Stone and earthen walls lined key crossings, with watchtowers signaling alarms at the first sight of northern scouts. Garrisons stationed there drilled for years in expectation of a great clash. But as the sway grew stronger, these outposts became overstretched. Supplies dwindled, troops went unpaid, and morale weakened. Some forts were little more than symbolic, their commanders more concerned with extracting resources from local peasants than preparing for war. What made the Qin situation worse was their over-reliance on the river. The Yangtze was a formidable barrier, yes, but it also bred a dangerous illusion, the belief that it was impregnable. Chen Shubao and his flatterers convinced themselves that no army could truly cross, that the river alone would shield the dynasty. They underestimated both the determination of the Sui and the ingenuity of their engineers. History had shown before, in the Three Kingdoms, in the struggles of the southern dynasties, that rivers could be crossed with enough preparation. But the Qin court chose to see the Yangtze not as a challenge to be constantly reinforced, but as a permanent guarantee of safety. In truth, the navy was a microcosm of the dynasty itself. Once strong, adaptable, and capable, it decayed under neglect. Resources that should have gone to shipbuilding and training instead funded palaces and banquets. Talented commanders were ignored in favor of courtiers who knew how to flatter. Soldiers who once prided themselves on river mastery muttered about empty stomachs and unpaid stipends. By the time the Sui launched their campaign, the Qin navy was still there, but hollowed out, unable to deliver the kind of unified resistance it once could. And yet, there's something poignant in how much faith people placed in it. Imagine a farmer standing on the riverbank near Jiankang, watching the silhouettes of Qin warships drift across the twilight waters. To him, those ships were more than wood and sail. They were hope, a promise that the North would never reach his fields. He didn't see the unpaid sailors, the leaking hulls, the thin rations. He saw protection. That trust, sadly, would be shattered when the Sui came. The Yangtze gave the Qin 3 decades of life they might not otherwise have had. It slowed northern ambitions, bought time for recovery, and gave ordinary people the illusion of safety. But in the end, a river can't save a dynasty if the men guarding it have lost faith, and if the rulers behind it mistake water for destiny. The Qin navy was their shield, but a shield cracked by neglect is no shield at all. The Chen Dynasty is often remembered as a fragile house hemmed in by the power of the North, but to see it only through that lens is to miss the quieter, subtler ways it navigated the world around it. A dynasty, no matter how small, doesn't live in isolation. Even as the Sui loomed, Qin emperors and ministers worked to maintain ties, diplomatic, commercial, and cultural, with the wider network of neighbors who could either destabilize or support them. The most obvious relationship was, of course, with the northern dynasties, Northern Qi, Northern Zhou, and later Sui. These were Chen's rivals, but also its unavoidable partners in diplomacy. Envoys crossed the Huai River carrying gifts, silk, lacquerware, sometimes even Buddhist relics. In return, the North sent back horses, furs, and promises of peace that were often as thin as parchment. These exchanges weren't just about goods. They were performances, rituals designed to signal that the Qin recognized the legitimacy of their northern neighbors, even while quietly hoping the Yangtze would hold them back. For the Qin court, these missions were acts of survival. A flattering embassy could buy a year of peace. A shipment of southern rice might soothe a northern appetite just long enough for Jiankang to regroup. But these gestures always carried humiliation too. Aristocrats in Jiankang muttered that their emperor bowed too easily, that envoys returned with tales of northern courts richer and more disciplined than their own. Diplomacy bought time, but it also underscored the imbalance between the south and the north. Beyond the great northern states, the Qin also looked east and south. Along the coast, maritime trade linked the dynasty to merchants from Southeast Asia. Ships laden with spices, pearls, and exotic woods docked in southern ports, while Chinese silk and ceramics traveled outward. These exchanges were small compared to the Great Silk Road caravans of the north, but they were lifelines for local economies. A governor with a good harbor might enrich his province with overseas goods, even as the central court struggled to tax it. Relations with neighboring peoples on the fringes of the south were equally delicate. In the mountains of Fujian and beyond lived non-Han tribes who alternated between trading with the dynasty and resisting its authority. Sometimes Qin generals mounted campaigns to pacify them, more often they negotiated truces or simply tolerated their autonomy. These groups were never fully integrated into the dynasty, but their cooperation mattered, their lands supplied timber, their warriors could be recruited as auxiliaries, and their raids could disrupt already fragile supply lines if ignored. Buddhism also served as a kind of soft diplomacy. Monks from Qin monasteries traveled north and abroad, carrying sutras and relics that signaled cultural sophistication even when political power was lacking. In turn, monks from India or Central Asia occasionally passed through the south, welcomed by emperors eager to showcase themselves as protectors of the Dharma. For a dynasty struggling with legitimacy, these exchanges mattered. They allowed the Qin to punch above their political weight, presenting themselves as part of the grand Buddhist world that stretched across Asia. Symbolism played a huge role in these relationships. Every embassy, every ritual exchange of gifts was theater. To the Qin court, sending tribute north didn't mean submission, it meant survival. To the Sui court, accepting tribute reinforced their superiority. Both sides knew the game, but both played it because the alternative was war. Diplomacy was a performance of mutual need disguised as hierarchy. Still, these relationships couldn't erase the Qin's growing isolation. The Sui, once they had unified the north, cut into the south's diplomatic space, absorbing or intimidating many of the partners the Qin might have leaned on. Maritime trade continued, but it couldn't replace the resources of a unified empire. Local truces with mountain tribes kept the borders quiet, but they didn't strengthen the dynasty's core. The Qin were left in a shrinking circle, their diplomacy increasingly desperate, their gestures increasingly hollow. And yet, even these gestures mattered to the people inside the dynasty. When an embassy returned from the north, bearing exotic gifts or reports of peace, it gave Jiankang a brief sigh of relief. Farmers could plant without fearing invasion, merchants could trade without fearing raids, and poets could write verses without the shadow of war pressing too close. Diplomacy didn't solve the dynasty's problems, but it bought them moments of breathing space. In fragile times, breathing space is everything. If you want to picture it, imagine a Qin envoy leaving Jiankang, his silk robe stiff with embroidery, his hands carrying gifts the state could barely afford. He travels north past ruined villages, across contested rivers, to stand in a grand northern hall before an emperor who sees him as a supplicant. He bows, he flatters, he bargains, and in that act, he buys his dynasty another year of life. That was Qin diplomacy, humble, precarious, but essential. It's easy, when telling the story of the Qin dynasty, to focus only on its struggles, the weak economy, the looming Sui threat, the court intrigues. But even short-lived dynasties are not simply chains of misery. For ordinary people, and even for the court itself, there were moments when life felt steady, when the state delivered on its most basic promise: order. These interludes of prosperity and peace, however fleeting, were real and perhaps all the more precious because they were fragile. Under Emperor Wen, Qin Qian, who succeeded Qin Baxian in 559, the dynasty enjoyed a period of relative calm. Wen was pragmatic, cautious, and more disciplined than the rulers who came after him. He repaired canals and dikes, ensured grain reserves were replenished, and tightened the bureaucracy enough to collect taxes with some regularity. His reign didn't bring dazzling expansion or Golden Age wealth, but it did give people a reprieve from chaos. After decades of rebellion and invasion under Liang, simply being able to plant crops without fear of marauding armies felt like prosperity. Even during Xu Bao's reign, before decline set in fully, there were flashes of brilliance. Jiankang, rebuilt after Ho Jing's sack, returned to life as a bustling capital. Markets reopened, artisans produced silk and lacquerware for trade, and festivals lit up the city with lanterns and song. For the wealthy, it was an age of elegance: garden banquets, music ensembles, calligraphy contests. For commoners, there were seasonal fairs, temple ceremonies, and harvest gatherings that brought color to otherwise difficult lives. The South's natural abundance played a role in these bright spells. Rice harvests could be bountiful in good years, filling granaries and easing tax burdens. Rivers and canals carried goods efficiently, linking villages to urban markets. When weather and politics cooperated, the South reminded its people why it had so often been seen as China's fertile refuge, a place where the land itself seemed to offer resilience. Culturally, peace gave space for beauty. Poets and musicians thrived under imperial patronage, producing works that spoke not only of courtly love but of landscapes, friendships, and fleeting joys. Buddhism flourished in tranquil years, its temples offering not just salvation but community. Taoist festivals marked the cycles of the seasons, giving people reasons to gather and celebrate. In these moments, the Chen Dynasty felt less like a struggling state and more like a continuation of the Southern tradition of refinement that had endured for centuries. It wasn't only the elite who felt this. Farmers, too, noticed the difference when taxes were predictable, when roads were safe enough for merchants to buy their surplus grain, when local magistrates enforced justice fairly. A season without bandits raiding villages or soldiers requisitioning food could feel like heaven's blessing. Families might save enough to repair roofs, marry off daughters with proper dowries, or even commission a small shrine to honor ancestors. These were modest gains, but in a fragile age, modesty was its own kind of prosperity. One telling sign of these peaceful moments is how later historians remembered them. Even though they criticized the Qin for weakness and indulgence, they admitted that under Emperor Wen and for part of Xu Bao's early reign, the South was relatively stable compared to the chaos that had preceded it. They may not have called it a golden age, but they recognized it as a reprieve. And for those who lived through it, a reprieve must have felt like gold. Still, prosperity under the Qin always carried an undertone of fragility. Everyone knew how quickly fortune could shift. A flood could ruin a harvest, a bandit raid could empty a village, a decree from Jiankang could double taxes overnight. Perhaps that's why poetry from the era often dwelled on impermanence, the beauty of a flower, the fleeting glow of the moon, the brief warmth of companionship. People cherished the present because the future was uncertain. If you want to picture these moments, imagine Jiankang during the Lantern Festival. The city's streets glow with thousands of lights, children laugh and chase each other, merchants sell sweet rice cakes, and poets gather in pavilions to compose verses under the moon. For that night, no one speaks of northern armies or heavy taxes. For that night, the dynasty feels whole, and life feels beautiful. That was the Chen at its best, not invincible, not rich, but alive, luminous, and human. For all the moments of peace and the cultural glow of Jiankang, the Chen dynasty was living on borrowed time. By the 580s, the signs of decline were everywhere, visible not just to ministers and generals, but to ordinary people in fields and markets. The house still stood, but its beams were rotting, its walls cracked. Anyone who looked closely enough could see the structure leaning, waiting for the first strong wind to topple it. The most glaring sign was extravagance at the top. Emperor Xu Bao's court, famous for its poetry and splendor, became a symbol of misplaced priorities. Palaces expanded, concubines gained power, and banquets drained the treasury while soldiers on the frontier went unpaid. Zheng Lihua's influence was exaggerated by later historians, but even if she wasn't the sole culprit, her presence at the emperor's side embodied the problem. Pleasure and indulgence were more pressing to the ruler than defense and reform. The contrast between courtly luxury and provincial poverty grew sharper by the year. The military, once the dynasty's shield, showed alarming weakness. Garrisons along the Huai and Yangtze complained of shortages. Ships in the navy rotted for lack of repairs, their crews half-drained and half-fed. Generals, neglected by the capital, lost confidence in their emperor. Some grew dangerously independent, others simply lost the will to fight. When the Sui tested border defenses with probing raids, too often Qin forces scrambled, disorganized, to repel them. The illusion of the heavenly moat, the Yangtze's protection, began to look more like wishful thinking. Economically, the foundations were crumbling. Taxes grew heavier, but returns shrank. Aristocratic clans shielded their estates, leaving the burden to fall on smallholders. Famine struck with greater frequency as dikes and canals went unrepaired. Peasants abandoned their land in despair, swelling refugee camps or turning to banditry. Markets thinned as trade declined, and foreign merchants increasingly preferred the stability of Sui markets to the uncertainty of Qin ports. Even the once flourishing silk industry sagged under inconsistent patronage. Another sign of decline was the atmosphere at court itself. Ministers no longer debated policy with urgency. They bickered over influence, aligning themselves with favored concubines or aristocratic patrons. Honest officials who tried to sound the alarm about the dynasty's fragility were dismissed or ignored. Those who flattered the emperor, assuring him that the Yangtze was unassailable, that the Sui were too busy in the north to threaten the south, rose in favor. Self-delusion hardened into policy, and the court began to live in a world of illusions. The people noticed. In villages along the river, families whispered about the might of the Sui and doubted whether their emperor could protect them. In the capital, artisans complained about rising levies and declining commissions. In monasteries, monks prayed more fervently, as if sensing the storm on the horizon. Dynasties don't just decline in ledgers and decrees, they decline in the collective mood of their people. And by the late 580s, that mood was turning toward despair. Symbolic omens added to the atmosphere. Floods, eclipses, and famines were interpreted as signs that heaven was withdrawing its mandate. Superstition mattered. A dynasty's legitimacy was as much about cosmic order as earthly power. Ministers tried to spin these disasters as opportunities for renewal, urging the emperor to reform, to humble himself before heaven. But Xu Bao preferred rituals of display over true reform. Incense filled the palace halls, but incense couldn't repair dikes or pay soldiers. Looking back, it's almost painful to see how visible the decline was. None of the problems were hidden. Everyone could see the unpaid troops, the starving peasants, the distracted court. Yet no one, not the emperor, not his ministers, not his generals, had the will or the unity to change course. It's the classic tragedy of dynasties. Decline rarely comes from a single blow. It comes from many small cuts, ignored until the bleeding can't be stopped. If you picture Jiankang at this stage, don't imagine a city in flames or collapse, not yet. Imagine instead a city glittering with festivals and banquets, but surrounded by provinces quietly emptying, soldiers muttering in garrisons, and farmers trudging to markets with lighter and lighter baskets of grain. Outwardly, life continued. Inwardly, the supports had already given way. The Chen Dynasty was not yet conquered, but by the late 580s, it was already defeated in spirit. The Sui didn't need to destroy a strong rival, they only had to push over a house that was already leaning. If the Chen Dynasty was a house with cracked beams and leaking roof tiles, the Sui Dynasty was the storm that finally brought it down. And unlike earlier northern rivals, the Sui were not divided, distracted, or decadent. They were unified, disciplined, and led by a ruler with both the patience to prepare and the will to strike. In the great chessboard of 6th century China, the Chen were running out of moves, while the Sui were just beginning their game. The story began with Yang Jian, the man who founded the Sui in 581 after seizing power from the northern Zhou. Known posthumously as Emperor Wen of Sui, he was no romantic conqueror, but a methodical architect of empire. Where Qin Shi Bao saw the Yangtze as an eternal shield, Yang Jian saw only a temporary obstacle. He reorganized his armies, rebuilt infrastructure, and centralized administration in ways that would make the Qin look provincial by comparison. One of his greatest strengths was his ability to consolidate quickly. He absorbed the northern Qi territories, brought aristocratic families under tighter control, and secured peace with steppe peoples to his north and west. By doing so, he freed his hands to look southward. For the first time in decades, the North was truly united, not a patchwork of competing states, but a single empire with the resources to overwhelm its smaller southern rival. Sui consolidation wasn't just military, it was economic and administrative. Land reforms, modeled on the equal field system, redistributed farmland to broaden the tax base, undercutting aristocratic monopolies. Canals and roads were repaired or newly built, ensuring that grain from the fertile north could be transported quickly to supply armies. The Qin, by contrast, struggled even to keep their own dikes in repair. The logistical difference was night and day. Sui soldiers marched with full granaries behind them, while Qin garrisons counted every bushel. Religion and ideology played a part too. The Sui portrayed themselves as restorers of the mandate of heaven, the dynasty destined to reunify China after centuries of division. They invoked both Confucian ideals of order and Buddhist imagery of universal kingship, appealing to elites and commoners alike. When envoys from Qin visited, they couldn't help but notice the confidence that radiated from Sui rituals. Compared to the brittle splendor of Jiankong, the north seemed robust, expansive, unstoppable. The psychological effect on the south was enormous. Merchants traveling between regions whispered of Sui efficiency, of bustling northern markets, of roads guarded and safe. Even in the Qin heartlands, people began to wonder if heaven had already shifted its favor northward. The idea of inevitability is powerful, and by the late 580s, the Sui cultivated it well. When armies eventually moved south, they didn't arrive as an unexpected invasion, but as the fulfillment of a destiny many already assumed would happen. It's worth noting that the Sui didn't rush. Emperor Wen knew the Qin were weak, but he also knew that patience would make victory easier. He spent years securing his northern frontiers, ensuring that no steppe invasion could distract him. He built up supply lines along the Huai, positioned garrisons strategically, and prepared fleets to match the Qin navy. He waited until his preparations were complete, until the Qin had squandered their last resources, before making his move. That deliberate pace was as frightening as any army. It showed that the Sui didn't see Qin as a threat, only as a prize to be collected when convenient. From Jiankong, this must have felt like watching a flood rise slowly upstream. No single event signaled doom, but the water level crept higher each year. The unification of the north, the absorption of qi, the reforms, the infrastructure, each was another inch on the flood gauge. Ministers who warned of the coming deluge were ignored. The emperor preferred flatterers who insisted the river would never overflow. But floods don't respect denial. By the eve of invasion in 588, the Sui were fully prepared. Their armies were vast, their supply lines secure, their morale high. The Qin, by contrast, were divided, underfunded, and complacent. It wasn't simply that one side was strong and the other weak, it was that the Sui embodied momentum while the Qin embodied inertia. History itself seemed to lean northward. If you picture it from above, imagine the map, the Sui, a solid, confident block stretching across the heart of China, the Qin, a small, fraying patch clinging to the south. One is expanding, consolidating, pressing outward. The other is shrinking inward, retreating into illusions of safety. In that imbalance lay the inevitable. The Sui's rise was the Qin's fall. By 588, the long pause was over. Emperor Wen of Sui, having unified the north and secured his rear, decided the time had come to extinguish the Qin once and for all. He wasn't reckless about it. This wasn't a hasty raid or a probing strike. It was a meticulously planned invasion designed to overwhelm the south in one decisive campaign. The order was given, a massive, coordinated assault across land and river, one that would bring the Yangtze dynasty to its knees. The numbers alone tell the story. Contemporary records speak of hundreds of thousands of men mobilized, perhaps exaggerated, as dynastic chroniclers often inflated figures, but even if halved, it was far more than the Chen could muster. The Sui advanced in three great columns, moving down toward the Huai and preparing to cross into Chen territory. Fleets of ships, constructed with precision and stocked with ample supplies, followed the advance. It was a campaign of sheer scale, the kind that made clear the difference between a unified empire and a fragile state. The Chen response? Hesitant, fragmented, and undermined by years of neglect. Generals who should have been preparing for this day found themselves scrambling. Some fortified towns along the Huai, others retreated south, unwilling to risk their men in what felt like a hopeless defense. At the center, Emperor Shu Bao dithered. Ministers urged him to mobilize fully, to rally the population, to put aside court indulgence and take personal command. Instead, he listened to flatterers who insisted the Yangtze would stop the Sui, just as it had stopped others before. Confidence and complacency combined into paralysis. When the Sui armies reached the river, their preparation showed. Engineers built massive pontoon bridges and rafts, protected by fleets of warships. Chen forces tried to resist, but their navy was too weak, their soldiers too hungry, their commanders too divided. One Chen flotilla after another was smashed, some by force, others by desertion. The myth of the heavenly moat collapsed almost overnight. The Yangtze, once thought impassable, became just another obstacle overcome by northern discipline. As Sui troops poured across, Chen defenses crumbled. Fortresses surrendered without prolonged sieges. Some generals abandoned their posts entirely, others, seeing the inevitability of defeat, defected to the Sui in hopes of preserving their status. Ordinary soldiers deserted in droves, unwilling to die for an emperor who had let them go unpaid and hungry. What had once been a dynasty's army became a scattering of broken units, pockets of resistance drowned in the tide. Meanwhile, in Jiankong, the mood was surreal. Emperor Shu Bao continued to indulge in banquets, surrounded by concubines and poets, even as the capital's defenses collapsed around him. Chroniclers, often harsh on fallen rulers, painted him as willfully blind, preferring music and pleasure to the urgent reality outside the palace walls. Whether entirely fair or not, the image stuck, an emperor lost in illusion while his dynasty burned. The Sui advance was shockingly fast. In less than a year, they overran Chen territory, sweeping through the lower Yangtze basin with barely a pause. By early 589, Sui forces encircled Jiankang itself. The heavenly moat had not protected the capital. The dynasty's great gamble, that rivers and rituals could replace preparation and reform, had failed. It's worth pausing here to note the sheer psychological shift this campaign represented. For decades, Southerners had believed the North could never fully cross the Yangtze. When the Sui did, it wasn't just a military defeat, it was the collapse of an idea. Once the river was breached, belief in Chen's survival dissolved like mist. Armies disbanded, civilians despaired, and ministers weighed the personal advantages of surrender. A dynasty cannot fight without belief, and by 589, the Chen had lost theirs entirely. If you imagine it cinematically, think of the riverbank in winter, Sui engineers hammering pontoons into place, war drums echoing across the current, Chen's soldiers staring wide-eyed as the impossible became reality. The river that had guarded their fathers was no longer a wall. It was a road for invasion. Behind them lay Jiankang, glittering but hollow, waiting for the final blow. By early 589, the Sui armies stood at the gates of Jiankang. The campaign that had begun with pontoon bridges and river crossings ended in a swift encirclement of the capital. What should have been the proud southern stronghold, the jewel of the Yangtze, was reduced to a desperate city with crumbling defenses and a ruler who seemed unwilling to face reality. The fall of Jiankang was not just a military defeat, it was a symbolic end to centuries of southern independence. Inside the city, panic mingled with disbelief. For generations, Jiankang had outlasted invasions. It had survived the Hojing rebellion, recovered from sieges, and remained a center of culture and trade even in decline. To its citizens, it must have seemed impossible that the capital could truly fall. But as news of surrendered fortresses and defected generals streamed in, hope gave way to dread. Refugees poured into the city, telling stories of villages abandoned, soldiers fleeing, and Sui banners advancing without resistance. Emperor Shubao responded in ways that later chroniclers immortalized and condemned. While his ministers urged immediate defense or negotiation, he reportedly retreated into indulgence, surrounding himself with concubines and continuing lavish banquets even as enemy armies tightened the noose. Zhang Lihua, his favorite, remained by his side, a symbol of distraction as much as loyalty. Whether exaggerated by hostile historians or not, the image stuck, the Emperor of Qin drunk on pleasure while his dynasty crumbled. When the Sui troops entered the city, resistance was minimal. There was no grand last stand, no dramatic defense of palace walls. Instead, Jiankong surrendered with startling swiftness. Soldiers laid down their arms, ministers hurried to present themselves to the victors. The capital's defenses, long neglected, could not withstand the disciplined northern troops. In many ways, Jiankang fell before the first Sui soldier set foot inside. The surrender was more psychological than military. The capture of Emperor Shubao became the defining scene of the dynasty's end. Carried from his palace, dressed not in armor but in silks, he was presented to the Sui general in charge of the conquest. Chroniclers say he was humiliated, forced to bow, his reign reduced to ashes in a single gesture. Zhang Lihua, blamed for distracting him and weakening the dynasty, was executed, not because she posed a threat, but because conquerors often need scapegoats. Her beauty, once celebrated, became her doom. The Sui wanted to erase any symbol of Qin power, and she was too potent a symbol to leave alive. The city itself, though spared from wholesale destruction, underwent a dramatic transformation. Jiankong was no longer the capital of an independent state. It became a provincial city in a reunified empire. Temples that once prayed for Chen's survival now chanted for Sui's prosperity. Officials who had sworn loyalty to Shubao quickly transferred their allegiance. Merchants adjusted, peasants continued to plant, but the soul of the city, the belief that it was the heart of a sovereign south, was extinguished. For the people of Jiankang, the fall must have felt both shocking and strangely anticlimactic. There was no cataclysmic battle in the streets, no burning of the city to the ground. Life continued, but under new rulers, with new taxes, and with the quiet knowledge that the old dynasty was gone forever. It was less a fiery collapse than a sudden silence, the extinguishing of a flame that had flickered for barely 3 decades. Symbolically, the fall of Jiankong marked the end of an era. For centuries, the South had stood apart from the North, carving its own dynasties, fostering its own culture. The Qin, though short-lived, were heirs to that tradition. Their fall in 589 was more than the end of one house, it was the end of southern independence until centuries later. With Jiankong's capture, the dream of a separate southern empire dissolved into the reality of reunification under the Sui. If you picture it cinematically, the scene is striking, Sui banners fluttering over the city walls, Qin soldiers disarmed, ministers bowing in resignation, and the last Qin emperor led away in silks, no longer a ruler but a captive. Behind him, his palace, once filled with poetry, banquets, and illusions, stood hollow, its halls echoing with the end of a dynasty. The fall of Jiankong in 589 was not just the end of a dynasty, it was the beginning of an uneasy transition. When the Sui banners replaced the Qin dragon, the world didn't stop. Farmers still had fields to tend, merchants still had goods to sell, temples still rang with chants. What changed was the framework around those lives: new rulers, new taxes, new loyalties, and a new sense that the age of the southern dynasties had finally ended. For the Qin elites, the aftermath was a delicate dance between survival and humiliation. Many surrendered quickly, hoping to preserve their titles or at least their lives. The Sui, pragmatic as always, understood the value of co-opting talent rather than eliminating it wholesale. Some Qin officials were absorbed into the new administration, serving as local magistrates or advisors. But the terms were clear. They were no longer lords of a dynasty, merely servants of an empire. The proud families of Jiankang, who once held sway over southern politics, now had to bow to northern authority. Not everyone fared so well. Members of the Qin imperial family were treated with a mix of mercy and contempt. Emperor Shu Bao himself was spared execution, a gesture of magnanimity that also reinforced Sui supremacy. Later accounts say he was given a minor title and lived the rest of his days in obscurity, a living reminder of Sui dominance. Some princes and relatives were absorbed into court life, others quietly sidelined, and a few executed to prevent future rebellion. Zhang Lihua, as we saw, was not so lucky. Blamed as a temptress and symbol of corruption, she was killed swiftly. Her death served as a warning. The Sui tolerated no remnants of Qin pride. For the common people, the aftermath was both relief and adjustment. On one hand, the end of war brought peace. No more endless requisitions for a failing defense, no more conscription into armies doomed to lose. For farmers along the Huai and Yangtze, the Sui conquest may have felt like a chance to breathe. With the North unified, borders were stable, trade routes reopened, and famine relief became more systematic. To them, the mandate of heaven had clearly shifted, and many embraced it pragmatically. On the other hand, Sui rule came with its own burdens. The empire was efficient, but efficiency meant tighter taxation, stricter control, and less tolerance for local autonomy. Aristocrats who had evaded levies under the Qin found themselves scrutinized under Sui reforms. Temples that had thrived as semi-independent centers of power were brought under closer state supervision. Monks and priests still prayed, but now their chants invoked blessings for the Sui throne. The freedoms of the Old South, such as they were, gave way to the discipline of northern administration. Culturally, the South remained vibrant, and in some ways, reunification helped. Trade flourished with the reopening of north-south routes, bringing wealth to coastal ports and river towns. Southern poetry, art, and music continued, though now framed as part of a larger empire rather than an independent tradition. Some in Jiankang even welcomed the broader horizon, curious about northern customs and opportunities. But beneath the surface, there lingered a quiet mourning, the sense that something uniquely southern had been lost. For peasants, the daily grind didn't change much at first. They still sowed rice, still bent under the sun, still handed grain to tax collectors. What mattered was not the name of the dynasty, but whether the officials were fair, whether the granaries were full, whether bandits were kept at bay. In that regard, the Sui at least offered more stability than the late Qin. Yet, even stability had its price. The state was hungrier, its demands more organized. Where Qin neglect had sometimes allowed peasants to slip through the cracks, Sui discipline ensured everyone paid. Relief and burden, side by side. Emotionally, the South must have felt a strange mix of resignation and relief. For older generations, who had lived through the fall of Liang, the chaos of Ho Jing, and the rise of Qin, the end of yet another dynasty was just another chapter in a weary story. For younger ones, it was perhaps the first time they felt part of something larger, the unification of China after centuries of division. A farmer in Jiang might not care much about the rhetoric of unity, but he would notice safer roads, fuller markets, and officials who actually showed up. That mattered more than dynastic pride. Still, the memory of Qin lingered. Families passed down stories of its emperors, its poets, its brief moments of elegance. Jiankang remained a cultural heart of the South, even if it was no longer a political one. The dynasty's name lived on not in power, but in memory, a reminder of a fragile house that held out for 3 decades, that gave its people moments of peace, and that fell with barely a fight. If you picture the aftermath, don't imagine a smoking ruin. Imagine Jiankang's markets reopening under Sui banners, farmers planting in the same fields, poets still writing verses by lantern light. Life went on different, heavier in some ways, lighter in others. Dynasties rise and fall, but the people endure. And in 589, endurance was the South's quiet victory, even as its dynasty vanished. The Qin dynasty lasted barely 32 years, a blink compared to the Han, the Tang, or even the troubled Liang before it. On paper, it could be dismissed as a footnote, a fragile regime that rose in the shadow of collapse, stumbled through weak governance, and was swallowed by the sway without much resistance. And yet, history rarely treats even short dynasties as meaningless. The Qin left traces, in culture, in memory, and in the long arc of China's reunification. Politically, the Qin dynasty's greatest legacy was its role as the last of the southern dynasties. With its fall in 589, the centuries-long division between North and South ended. The Qin were the final guardians of southern independence, the last line of emperors to rule from Jiankong before the Sui reunited the realm. Their failure underscored the inevitability of reunification, but their existence also kept the dream of a separate South alive for 3 decades longer than many expected. That delay mattered. It gave the South time to recover from Ho Jing's devastation, to rebuild cities, and to preserve cultural traditions that would enrich the later Tang. Culturally, the Qin contributed to the refinement of Southern identity. Their court, though criticized for indulgence, nurtured poets, musicians, and calligraphers whose works survived into later eras. The lingering elegance of Jiankang, with its gardens, festivals, and artistic gatherings, became part of the mythology of the South. Even in decline, the Qin embodied a kind of southern grace that contrasted with the austere, martial culture of the North. Later dynasties, when looking back, often cast the Qin as decadent, but that decadence was also remembered as beauty. Religion was another sphere of legacy. The Qin emperor's patronage of Buddhism and Taoism helped solidify these faiths in southern society. Temples flourished, sutras were copied, statues were carved. These institutions outlived the dynasty itself, providing continuity through the Sui and Tang. The Qin may not have left great political innovations, but they deepened the South's spiritual landscape, embedding Buddhism in ways that endured long after their banners fell. For the people, the Qin dynasty's legacy was more ambiguous. To peasants, it was remembered less for emperors and more for burdens, taxes, corvée labor, neglect during famine. But even here, there were moments of gratitude. Emperor Wen's pragmatism brought years of relative peace, and the dynasty's ability to hold the Yangtze line for decades gave villagers respite from endless war. Their memory of Qin was likely bittersweet, a regime flawed, often disappointing, but preferable to chaos. Historians have not been kind to the Qin. Writing under the Sui and Tang, chroniclers emphasized decadence, corruption, and weakness, painting Qin Shubao as the archetype of a foolish last ruler, distracted by women and wine while his empire collapsed. Zhang Lihua became a cautionary tale, her beauty weaponized as an explanation for dynastic failure. These moralizing stories fit a pattern. Fallen dynasties were always blamed for indulgence, their rulers cast as warnings rather than men. Yet beneath the exaggeration, kernels of truth remain. The Qin did falter through neglect, and they did underestimate the strength of the North. And yet, legacy isn't only what historians write, it's what lingers in memory. Jiankong remained a cultural beacon, its poets and artisans influencing the flourishing Tang dynasty. The Qin, however flawed, preserved that southern tradition long enough for it to merge into the new, unified China. Without them, the South might have been more thoroughly devastated, its cultural brilliance dimmed. Their legacy, then, is not of power but of preservation. In a way, the Qin dynasty embodies the fragility of history itself. Not every dynasty needs to conquer, expand, or dazzle to matter. Some exist to bridge the gap, to carry a torch through dark years, even if their flame burns dim. The Qin were such a dynasty, fragile, yes, but also necessary. They remind us that history is not only about triumphs, but about endurance, about holding on just long enough for something larger to emerge. If you imagine their legacy visually, picture a lantern at the end of a long night. Its flame is small, flickering, almost spent. And yet, it has carried light through the darkness, enough to guide the way until dawn arrives. The Qin dynasty was that lantern, faint, fragile, but part of the path that led to reunification and the grandeur that followed.